I never understood the allure of camping. The thought of sleeping in a tent under the open sky with nothing but the thin fabric of a shelter between me and whatever was lurking in the woods just seemed like an invitation for trouble. But when my friends, Tom and Rachel, insisted we go on a weekend camping trip to a remote spot in the woods, something about getting away from the world, I reluctantly agreed. I didn't want to be the odd one out. The place we were going to was in a national forest, about an hour's drive from the nearest town. It wasn't a popular camping spot, more of a secluded area for those who wanted peace and quiet. Tom had found the spot on some website and was adamant that it was perfect for a weekend escape. No cell service, no distractions, just nature. He even mentioned that people had claimed to experience a kind of eerie calmness out there. But he said it in a way that made it sound almost intriguing, so I agreed. We arrived in the late afternoon. The weather was perfect, clear skies, a gentle breeze, and the smell of pine and fresh earth in the air. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the trail as we unpacked our gear. I could already feel the unease creeping in. The trees were too dense here, the kind that seemed to swallow up the light rather than filter it. The kind that made you feel like the world was closing in on you. I set up my tent while Rachel started a fire. Tom, as usual, was in charge of the camp stove. The area around us was quiet. Too quiet. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just the distant sound of water flowing from a creek somewhere off to the side and the occasional crackling of the fire. After we got everything settled, we sat around the fire, eating canned chili and drinking cheap beer. I tried to relax, but something felt off. The woods around us seemed unnaturally still, as if they were holding their breath. I kept scanning the tree line, half expecting to see something move out of the corner of my eye, but I didn't mention it. I didn't want to sound paranoid. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks into the darkening sky. We talked about mundane things, work, life, and our plans for the next day. But no matter how hard I tried to focus on the conversation, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Tom eventually got up to check the perimeter of the campsite, the faint light of his flashlight bouncing off the trees. He returned shortly, saying everything seemed fine. But by then, the chill in the air had deepened. The temperature dropped quickly, and we huddled closer to the fire, wrapping ourselves in blankets. It wasn't long before the wind picked up, not in a natural, soothing way, but in sharp gusts that sent the trees creaking and swaying. A strange sound seemed to come from deeper in the woods, a low, guttural growl that seemed to echo through the trees. I froze, my stomach twisted. I glanced at Tom and Rachel, but they hadn't heard it. I knew I wasn't imagining it. The noise wasn't something a wild animal would make. It was too deliberate. Rachel seemed unsettled, though, shifting in her seat and looking around. She said she was going to check on her tent, but I could tell she was avoiding looking too closely at the woods. Tom laughed it off, as if it was nothing more than a trick of the wind. Night came fast. The fire flickered and died down, casting only a dim glow around the campsite. We all retreated to our tents, and I could hear the sound of Rachel's breathing as she settled into hers. The wind outside howled, and every now and then, the trees seemed to groan under the pressure. I tried to sleep, but I kept hearing noises, scraping sounds against the fabric of my tent. I told myself it was just branches or small animals, but it didn't feel right. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. Not the usual scurrying of animals, but something heavier, slower. I lay completely still, listening. The sounds came closer, then stopped just outside my tent. My heart was pounding in my chest. I dared not move, afraid that whatever it was would hear me and come closer. The air felt thick with tension. Then, just as quickly as it had come, the noise stopped. I waited in silence for what felt like hours, but nothing else moved. Slowly, I allowed myself to breathe again, but I kept my eyes wide open, staring at the fabric of the tent. Whatever had been outside, it was gone. But the unease didn't leave. It lingered in the air, as though the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something. Morning came with no sign of whatever had been outside. The sun rose, bringing light to the shadows of the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, that it hadn't been an animal or the wind. But when I told Tom and Rachel, they just shrugged it off. "You probably heard a bear or something," Tom said. Rachel didn't comment, but she looked uneasy. She kept checking her tent as if afraid to go near it. The rest of the day passed in a kind of half-uneasy normalcy. We hiked, made lunch by the creek, and talked about going home early. I kept catching myself glancing over my shoulder, convinced that something was out there, watching us. It wasn't until the second night that the weirdness escalated. We were sitting around the fire again, but this time there was a distinct feeling of being surrounded, as if the trees were pressing in on us. Rachel kept checking the sky, her eyes scanning the treetops. I was starting to think it wasn't just me who felt it. The air was thick, charged, like the calm before a storm. Then it happened again. That same deep, growling sound from before, coming from deeper in the forest. But this time it was closer, much closer. Tom immediately jumped up and grabbed his flashlight, scanning the darkness. "It's just an animal," he said, though his voice sounded strained. "Probably a coyote or something." But we all knew it wasn't a coyote. Whatever it was big, and it was watching us. We decided to pack up and leave the next morning, but none of us got any sleep that night. Every little sound, every movement in the trees set us on edge. The wind howled through the branches, but there was something off about it. It wasn't the wind that bothered me. It was the sense that something was waiting, hidden in the woods, just beyond the reach of the firelight. By the time morning came, we were all exhausted, our nerves frayed. We packed up as quickly as we could, trying to ignore the noises in the trees. The wind had died down, but the feeling of being watched never left. We drove out of the forest as quickly as we could, the gravel road kicking up dust behind us. As we left, I glanced back one last time, and for a split second, I thought I saw something moving in the trees, but it was gone before I could make sense of it. When we got back to town, I didn't feel any relief. In fact, the feeling of unease followed me. I kept thinking about the sounds, the strange growl, and the sensation of being watched. It didn't make sense. What had been out there? We hadn't seen any animals. No tracks. Nothing. Weeks went by, and I tried to push it all out of my mind. But every time I closed my eyes, I could hear that growl. Every time I walked through the woods or heard the wind rustling the trees, I could feel that same weight in the air. I don't go camping anymore. I don't know what we encountered out there in the woods, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never return. Some places in the wild, some areas of the forest, they're meant to be left alone. And I learned the hard way that sometimes it's better not to find out what's lurking in the shadows. I had always been a fan of the outdoors, a lover of the woods and everything that comes with it. The fresh air, the isolation, the beauty of nature. So when my friend, Jake, suggested we go camping for the weekend, I didn't hesitate for a second. I'd been on trips before, but something about this one felt different from the start. We drove for hours, the road twisting and turning as we left the city behind. The sun was beginning to set as we reached our destination, a secluded camping site, far away from the hustle and bustle. Jake had been there once before, and he promised me it was perfect. We parked the car by the edge of the woods, the towering trees casting long shadows over the clearing. The air was cooler than I expected, and the scent of pine mixed with damp earth. We unloaded our gear, setting up camp in the fading light. The fire pit was already dug, and the logs were scattered around it. It wasn't much of a campsite, but it felt right. I could already hear the crickets starting to chirp, their high-pitched songs echoing through the trees. Jake was getting the fire started while I pitched the tent. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was just a subtle thing, a sense of unease that settled over me like a thick fog. I brushed it off, telling myself it was nothing. After all, I had camped plenty of times before. By the time the tent was up and the fire was crackling, night had fully fallen. The stars were bright above us, the sky clear without a cloud in sight. We sat by the fire, cooking some simple food and talking about nothing in particular. It was peaceful, but that nagging feeling in the back of my mind wouldn't leave. The forest, though beautiful, felt oppressive. It wasn't the kind of place where you could forget you were surrounded by so much wilderness. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig, seemed louder than it should have been. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. The feeling of being watched crept up on me like a slow-moving fog. Jake noticed I was quiet, but he didn't say anything about it. He was too busy staring into the flames, lost in his thoughts. Eventually, the fire died down to embers, and we decided to get some sleep. I crawled into the tent, trying to push away the anxiety that clung to me. The sounds of the forest filled my ears, the wind rustling the leaves, distant animal calls, and the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. It should have been soothing, but it only made me feel more on edge. I lay there for what felt like hours, my mind racing with every little noise that surrounded us. I kept thinking I heard something moving outside the tent, something large and heavy, but every time I would listen closely, it would stop. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind or an animal, but the feeling of being watched was growing stronger. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a fitful sleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up with a start. The silence in the tent was suffocating. The usual sounds of the forest had stopped. No wind, no animals, not even the rustle of leaves. Just complete silence. My heart was racing, and I could feel the blood rushing in my ears. I lay there in the dark, staring at the fabric of the tent above me, waiting for something, anything, to break the stillness. And then I heard it, a soft, slow tapping sound. It came from the direction of the trees, just beyond the edge of the campfire's glow. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but the sound continued. Tap, 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 like someone or something was tapping its fingers against a tree, just out of sight. I held my breath, hoping it would stop, but it didn't. The tapping grew louder, and now I could hear the faint rustle of movement, too. Something was out there, moving quietly between the trees, drawing closer to our camp. My stomach twisted into knots. I glanced over at Jake, who was still asleep, completely unaware of the noise. I wanted to wake him up, but I couldn't move. Something was holding me in place, as if my body refused to react to the fear coursing through me. The tapping stopped. I lay there in the dead silence, my mind racing. What was it? Was it an animal? Person? My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen, but all I could hear was the sound of my own breath. Then, out of nowhere, I heard something else, a low, grating sound. Came from right outside the tent. Something was dragging its feet across the ground, scraping against the dirt. I froze, not daring to make a sound. The scraping noise came closer, then stopped directly outside the tent, just inches away from where I lay. The silence returned, suffocating and thick. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my body tense with fear. I held my breath, afraid to even move a muscle. The minutes dragged on, felt like hours. And then, just when I thought I might lose my mind, the sound of footsteps faded into the distance. Slowly, cautiously, I reached for the zipper of the tent and pulled it open just a crack, peering out into the darkness. There was nothing there, just the campfire's dying embers and the stillness of the forest. I felt a strange mix of relief and confusion. What had I just heard? Couldn't have been real. Maybe I had been dreaming, or maybe it was just an animal passing by. But something told me that wasn't the case. There was a presence out there, something that didn't belong. I closed the tent slowly, trying to calm my breathing. I was about to lie back down when I heard it again. This time it was closer, a loud snap of a twig, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavier this time. Whoever or whatever was out there, it wasn't leaving. The first few days were calm, nothing out of the ordinary. A simple camping trip in the woods with nothing but the sounds of rustling leaves, the occasional chirping of birds, and the crackling of the campfire to keep me company. I had come to this part of the forest many times before. It was always peaceful here. You could lose yourself in the quiet, the kind of peace that only nature could offer. I'd driven out on a Friday afternoon, hoping to escape the noise and the stress of city life. The plan was simple: set up camp, cook some meals over the fire, and just relax for a few days. No distractions, no obligations, just me and the woods. The sun had been low when I arrived at the clearing, the trees around it tall and thick. I'd pitched my tent by a small creek that ran through the area. The sound of the water was soothing. The whole place smelled of pine, damp earth, and the freshness of the forest floor. I unpacked my gear, setting up the tent carefully, and then gathered some wood to start a fire. The fire crackled to life after a few moments, and I sat back to admire the small flame that illuminated the darkness around me. The first night was easy. I ate my canned chili and watched the stars. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. The night felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. As I laid down in my tent, the only thing I could hear was the distant sound of the creek and the occasional owl in the trees. It was exactly what I needed. The next morning, I woke up early. The sunlight filtering through the trees made everything look golden. I packed my backpack with a little water, a snack, and my map. I wanted to do a bit of hiking that day to get deeper into the woods. The trails here were pretty well marked, but I had learned to be cautious. The forest could be tricky sometimes. One wrong turn and you could end up completely lost. But I wasn't worried. I had done this plenty of times before. I left my camp set up and started walking along a familiar trail that led to a larger lake about 2 miles away. As I walked, I felt the weight of my footsteps sinking into the earth beneath me, the crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot. I didn't see many animals, though I did spot a few squirrels and birds fluttering through the trees. I paused for a moment, taking a deep breath of the fresh air, listening to the distant call of a crow. The place felt safe. But as the day went on, something started to feel off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on at first, just a slight unease that settled in the back of my mind. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing, just nerves. But still, there was something wrong with the woods that day. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed a little too quiet, or the way the wind seemed to blow in the wrong direction, moving the branches in odd patterns. I decided to cut my hike short. Instead of continuing to the lake, I turned around and headed back to my camp. The walk back should have been quick, but the uneasy feeling lingered. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the trail and the feeling of the sun on my skin. It wasn't until I was halfway back that I noticed something strange. The trail I was walking on had changed. It was subtle at first, an extra turn here, a broken branch there. But then I started to realize something was wrong. The path wasn't as I remembered it. It was almost like the woods were reshaping themselves. The trees looked different. The angles of the shadows were all wrong. It was like I was walking on a trail that didn't exist the day before. I pulled out my map and checked my position. According to the map, I should have been almost back to the clearing. But the trail looked unfamiliar. Panic started creeping into my chest. I stopped and turned in a full circle, trying to recognize something. Anything. But nothing looked familiar. The landscape had shifted somehow. The creek that I knew should be close by was nowhere to be seen. I took a deep breath and forced myself to stay calm. I knew what I needed to do. I needed to stay put. I would wait for a bit, collect my thoughts, and figure out how to retrace my steps. But when I went to sit on a nearby rock, I froze. There, just at the edge of my vision, I saw a figure. It was standing near a large tree, barely visible, almost blending in with the surroundings. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. The figure was gone. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding. Was I seeing things? Had I been out in the sun too long, losing track of time and reality? I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me. I tried to force myself to move forward. I had to get back to camp. But as I walked, I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced that someone or something was trailing me just out of sight. The trail twisted in ways I didn't recognize. It felt wrong, like I was being led off course on purpose. The trees, which had once felt so welcoming, now seemed oppressive. their branches reaching out like hands trying to grab me. The silence around me grew heavier. The normal noises of the forest, the wind in the trees, the rustling of animals were gone. It was like everything had suddenly stopped. Finally, after what felt like hours of walking in circles, I stumbled upon a familiar landmark, a large rock that had always been near my camp. Relief washed over me, but the fear didn't dissipate. The place felt wrong now, like it had shifted while I wasn't paying attention. My hands shook as I tried to quicken my pace. I just needed to get back to the tent, to the fire. It was getting dark, and the forest felt alive in a way it never had before. The shadows seemed deeper, longer. When I reached the clearing where my camp was, I felt a mixture of relief and dread. Everything was exactly as I had left it, except for one thing: the fire pit. It had been left cold. The ashes settled as if no one had tended it in hours. I was certain I'd put the fire out when I left, but now it was as though the fire had been left to burn itself out. It was eerie, like the camp had been untouched for longer than it should have been. I hurriedly checked my supplies, just to make sure nothing had been disturbed. The food I'd left was untouched, and my gear was still where I had left it. But something was off. I couldn't explain it. The air felt thicker, as if I was being smothered by it. I didn't know what had happened, but I knew I couldn't stay another night out here. The whole situation, the way the woods felt different, the way the fire pit seemed untouched, it made my skin crawl. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, trying to force myself to focus and not panic. The drive back to the nearest town was a blur. I didn't care to look at the trees anymore, not after what I'd experienced. I just needed to get out of there. My hands were still trembling when I reached the edge of the woods. I didn't even care that I'd left my camp setup. I was just glad to be away. When I arrived at the town, I found a small diner and sat down to collect myself. The waitress came by, and I ordered a cup of coffee. As I sat there, trying to calm my breathing, I overheard a conversation between two locals sitting at the next table. They were talking about the woods. "Yeah, strange things happen out there sometimes," one of them said, almost casually. "Not everyone comes back the same way they left. People go missing all the time. But it's not just that. Sometimes it's like the forest changes, feels different, like it's trying to keep you there." My blood ran cold. They weren't talking about ghosts or spirits. They were talking about something else, something real. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. I don't know what I encountered in those woods, or how the forest seemed to shift on me, but I'll never go back. No matter how much I loved the woods before, something about that place changed. Something unnatural happened, and I don't plan on finding out what. The sky was beginning to dim, the sun sinking into the treeline as I adjusted my pack and trudged forward. I had been hiking since late morning, my boots crunching over dry leaves and loose gravel, my breath steady but growing heavier with each mile. I had planned this solo camping trip for weeks, eager to get away from the noise of the city and immerse myself in the stillness of the woods. I wasn't new to this. I had been on plenty of solo trips before, and I was confident in my ability to handle whatever nature threw my way. The forest was dense, the towering trees stretching endlessly in every direction. The deeper I went, the more the sounds of civilization faded until all that remained was the whisper of wind through the branches and the occasional chirp of a bird. There was something calming about being so far from everything. No cars, no voices, just me and the wilderness. By the time I reached the spot I had marked on my map, the light was fading fast. It was a small clearing beside a narrow stream, with just enough open space for my tent and a small fire. The water was shallow, trickling softly over smooth stones, and the air carried the fresh scent of damp earth and pine. I dropped my pack with a sigh of relief, rolling my shoulders to ease the stiffness before getting to work setting up camp. My tent went up quickly, a simple one-person setup that I could assemble in my sleep. I gathered some wood for a fire, using my hatchet to break the larger branches into manageable pieces. By the time I struck a match, the temperature had already dropped, and I was grateful for the warmth as flames licked at the dry wood, crackling softly in the quiet night. I ate a simple meal from my pack, watching the fire dance as darkness settled around me. The forest felt different at night. The familiar sounds of birds were replaced by the distant rustling of unseen animals, the occasional snap of a twig in the undergrowth. It wasn't unsettling, just different, the kind of quiet that made you more aware of every sound, every movement in the trees. After finishing my meal, I took a few minutes to secure my food in a tree a good distance from camp. I knew better than to leave anything that might attract unwanted visitors. Bears weren't common in this area, but raccoons, foxes, and other small scavengers could be just as troublesome. Satisfied that everything was in order, I crawled into my tent, zipping the flap shut behind me. My sleeping bag was warm, and my body was sore from the long hike. The fire outside had died down to embers, casting a faint orange glow against the fabric of my tent. I closed my eyes, listening to the soft rustling of leaves outside, letting the steady sounds of the forest lull me into sleep. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire had gone out completely, and the tent was shrouded in darkness. I lay still, listening. The forest was quiet, too quiet. The usual nighttime sounds had faded into absolute silence, the kind that sent a prickle of unease down my spine. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate sound. Footsteps, not the light, scurrying kind made by small animals. These were heavier, slower, human. My breath caught in my throat. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It wasn't close, at least not yet, but it was there. A steady crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig. Someone was out there. I stayed completely still, my heartbeat hammering against my ribs. I didn't have a weapon, just the hatchet I had used earlier, which was lying outside near the fire pit. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. This was a remote area, miles from any main trail. I hadn't seen another person all day, so who the hell was out here in the middle of the night? The footsteps continued, slow and methodical, circling the perimeter of my camp. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. They wanted me to know they were there. I felt a cold sweat trickle down my back. My tent suddenly felt too thin, too fragile. Just a flimsy barrier of fabric between me and whoever was outside. Then, just as suddenly as they started, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. I strained my ears, but there was nothing. No movement, no breathing, nothing. Just the dark, empty quiet of the forest. Minutes passed. I didn't dare move. My whole body was tense, my muscles locked in place. I didn't know if they had left or if they were still out there, watching, waiting. My mind kept conjuring images of someone standing just outside my tent, inches away, listening to me breathe. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Eventually, exhaustion won out over fear, and at some point, I must have drifted into a restless sleep. When I woke up, the first rays of sunlight were filtering through the trees. For a moment, I almost convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing. But then I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. There, in the dirt surrounding my camp, were footprints. Large, deep, too big to be mine. I scanned the area, my pulse quickening. Whoever had been out here hadn't just passed through. They had circled my camp, stood just outside my tent, watching. A chill ran through me. I moved quickly, packing up my gear with shaking hands. I didn't bother with breakfast. I just needed to get out of there, to put as much distance between myself and that clearing as possible. As I retraced my steps back toward the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, that whoever had been out there during the night wasn't done. I hiked fast, barely stopping for water. The unease stayed with me, growing stronger with every step. It wasn't until I reached my car, locked the doors, and started the engine that I finally let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I never went back to that spot again. Never camped alone after that. I still don't know who was out there that night, and I don't want to know. I decided to go camping alone, far away from the crowded parks and buzzing campsites, into the more secluded forest. I'd been looking for peace and solitude for weeks, needing to get away from everything. The noise, the people, the expectations. Something about being surrounded by trees and fresh air seemed like the perfect way to reset my mind. I'd never been out in the woods this deep before, but I figured it wouldn't be much different from other camping trips. I made sure to pack enough food, water, and gear, but I left behind the gadgets I usually carried: phone, laptop, anything that might tie me back to the outside world. Just me and nature. The campsite was a small, secluded area, hidden from the main trail, far from any roads or signs of civilization. When I arrived, I set up my tent by a small creek that cut through the valley, its gentle gurgling a relaxing soundtrack to the stillness of the forest. The only sounds were the wind in the leaves and the occasional bird call. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground. I knew it would be dark soon, but I wasn't concerned. I had everything I needed, and the evening was already calm and peaceful. That night, I built a small fire and roasted a few hot dogs, just the basics. I sat near the fire, watching the flames flicker and dance, feeling content. The warmth of the fire against the cool air was comforting, and I soon found myself lost in thought, staring into the crackling embers. I didn't realize how quickly the time had passed until the stars began to show through the gaps in the trees. It felt like I had everything under control, like nothing could disrupt the tranquility I had found. But as the night wore on, something shifted. At first, I couldn't quite put my finger on it. There was a subtle change in the air, a shift in the atmosphere, as if something had stirred in the woods around me. It wasn't the typical night noises of animals moving through the forest, which I was used to. No, this felt different. An unnatural silence that seemed to hang heavy in the air. I figured it was nothing, just the natural rhythm of the woods at night. But as the fire began to burn lower, I started to feel the weight of the silence pressing in on me, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder toward the dark forest at the edge of the campsite. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper than they should have been, as if the night had swallowed up the forest entirely. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the solitude was playing tricks on my mind. So I stood up, grabbed a stick, and poked at the fire, sending up a small burst of sparks. The flames crackled and popped, and for a moment, everything seemed normal again. But then, just as I was about to sit back down, I heard something, a snap. I froze, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. It wasn't the sound of a branch breaking, like I'd expected. It was more deliberate, like footsteps in the underbrush, soft but unmistakable. I squinted into the darkness, trying to discern any movement, but the shadows were thick, and the trees were too close together. Another snap. I was immediately alert. My first thought was that it was a deer or some other animal, but the sound was too consistent, too deliberate. Whatever it wasn't moving like a normal animal. I reached into my bag for my flashlight and shone it toward the noise. The beam cut through the darkness, but it didn't reach far enough to reveal anything. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing thoughts. There were plenty of animals in these woods. Bears, cougars, wolves, but this wasn't the kind of sound they made. I had to be overthinking it, yet the tension didn't ease. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there, watching me. The night felt colder now. I went back to the fire and added a few more logs, the flames briefly flaring up. The warmth didn't reach far enough to settle my nerves. I kept my eyes on the dark spaces between the trees, feeling like the world around me had grown too quiet, too still. Minutes passed, maybe hours, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I couldn't ignore it any longer. The sounds from the woods had stopped, but the unease remained, thick and suffocating. I couldn't stay here, not like this. I stood up abruptly, grabbed my pack, and made my way toward the trail, intending to walk back to the car. But when I turned to look at the fire, I realized with a sudden chill that the flames had dimmed. In fact, the entire campsite seemed darker than it should have been, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. I shone my flashlight in the direction of the creek, but the beam barely reached the water's edge. My breath caught in my throat when I realized I was no longer alone. I had seen something move in the dark, a figure tall and thin, standing just beyond the edge of the trees. My pulse raced, and a cold sweat broke out on my skin. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't a person either. It was something else, something wrong. I turned on my heel and began walking briskly, trying to force myself to stay calm. The sound of footsteps followed me, though I couldn't tell whether they were my own or not. My mind screamed at me to run, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. The trees seemed to close in around me, and the night felt like it was pressing against my back, suffocating me. I stumbled forward, the flashlight trembling in my hand. I had to get out of here. My heart pounded in my chest as I pushed through the underbrush, the trail becoming more and more difficult to navigate. My surroundings felt unfamiliar now, twisted in a way that made the whole forest feel like a maze. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps stopped. I froze. I strained my ears to hear any sound, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat. Then, in the distance, I saw it. A faint light. It was my campfire, still burning, still glowing in the dark. I turned quickly and started back toward the campsite, this time running, my feet pounding the ground. The light of the fire became brighter and more distinct as I neared it. I couldn't explain it, but something in my gut told me I had to get back to the fire. I burst into the clearing, breathing heavily, my chest aching. But when I reached the campsite, everything was exactly as I'd left it. The fire was still crackling, the tent still standing, the shadows of the trees still looming in the distance. I checked the entire area, the woods around the campsite, the creek. There was no sign of anything, no figure, no strange sounds, just the fire and the night, as if nothing had happened. I sat by the fire, trying to gather my thoughts, but I couldn't explain what I had just experienced. My instincts told me I wasn't alone, that something had been out there, but whatever it was gone now. I felt a strange sense of relief, but also a deep unease that I couldn't shake. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. I stayed by the fire, watching the flames flicker, too scared to sleep. By the time morning came, the first light of dawn cutting through the trees, I had packed up my gear and decided to leave. I didn't look back as I walked away from that campsite, the eerie stillness of the forest still lingering in my mind. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never camp in that part of the woods again. It had been too quiet, too unnerving. Whatever it was out there, I had no desire to encounter it again. I had always loved camping. There was something about being out in the wilderness, far away from the noise and clutter of everyday life, that felt like an escape. My friends and I often spent weekends in the woods, hiking trails and camping by lakes. But this time it was different. I had decided to go solo. Maybe it was the stress of work, or just a desire to be alone, but I felt like this would be the perfect opportunity to clear my mind. So, I packed my gear, a small tent, some food, and a few essentials, and set off for the forest just a few hours outside the city. The weather was perfect when I arrived. Clear skies, a slight breeze, and the air was crisp with that earthy scent of pine and damp soil. The campsite I had chosen was tucked away in a remote part of the forest, far from any trailheads or busy areas. I liked the idea of solitude, of being the only one there. Setting up the tent took longer than I expected. I had done it plenty of times before, but today I was slower. My hands felt strangely unsteady, like I was being watched, but I told myself it was just nerves. It was quiet, so quiet, the kind of quiet that presses in on you, like the whole forest is holding its breath. By the time I finished setting up, the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. I built a fire, the crackling flames the only sound in the otherwise still evening. The warmth of the fire was comforting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was a sensation I couldn't quite put into words, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of movement in the shadows of the trees. I tried to push the feeling aside and focused on the beauty of the night. The sky above me was a deep shade of indigo, the stars twinkling like tiny diamonds scattered across velvet. The forest was alive with the sounds of nature, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. I settled into my camp chair, trying to enjoy the peace, but the unease persisted. It was an odd sensation, like the forest itself was too quiet. No animals stirred, no rustling in the bushes, no distant calls. I couldn't help but feel as if I was the only living thing around for miles. My eyes darted from shadow to shadow, trying to reassure myself that it was nothing. Then, a sound broke the silence. First, it was faint, just a whisper of movement, like something brushing against the trees. I thought it was the wind, but then it came again, closer this time, unmistakable. Something was moving in the forest. My heart started to race, and I stood up, peering into the darkness. There was nothing, just the faint shadows of the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I shook my head. I was being paranoid. It was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a fox. The thought did little to calm me. In fact, it only made me more nervous. I wasn't used to being alone like this, and my mind was running wild with possibilities. The forest wasn't as peaceful as I'd first thought. The quiet was unnatural. I sat back down, trying to ignore the creeping sense of dread. I focused on the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker, their warm glow casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. But just as I started to settle again, the sound came again, this time louder. It was like something was walking through the underbrush, just out of sight, moving with purpose. I held my breath, listening intently. The sound paused, then resumed, closer than before. The firelight flickered in my eyes, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving between the trees. A figure? No, it was too quick to make out, just a shadow, but it sent a cold shiver up my spine. I didn't know what to think. The logical part of my brain told me it was just an animal, but the rest of me felt like I was being hunted. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and shone it into the darkness. The beam of light cut through the trees, revealing nothing but the forest. No eyes staring back, no movement. The silence seemed almost mocking. I sat down again, heart pounding in my chest, but I couldn't stop myself from checking the surroundings constantly. Every little sound made me jump. The wind now sounded like footsteps, the rustling leaves like whispers. I realized I hadn't eaten anything all day, and my stomach growled. I didn't feel like cooking, though. I just wanted to get through the night. The temperature dropped quickly as the sun vanished completely behind the horizon. I wrapped myself in my jacket, trying to stay warm. The fire was starting to die down, the flames now small and weak. I needed to gather more wood, but I hesitated. The forest beyond the campfire was a black void, and I didn't want to leave the light. But I knew I had to. I stood, grabbing my hatchet and heading toward the pile of fallen branches I had seen earlier. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I moved, and every step seemed to echo too loudly in the still night air. My footsteps crunched on the dry leaves beneath me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I reached the pile of wood, I picked up a few branches and turned to head back to the fire, but something stopped me. It was the quiet. The same unnatural silence that had settled over the campsite earlier had returned. Even the wind had stopped. My breath caught in my throat, and for the first time in my life, I realized how truly alone I was. There was no sound, no crickets, no owls, nothing. I glanced over my shoulder, the flashlight trembling in my hand as I slowly turned. The beam of light swept over the dark trees, but there was no sign of movement. I hurried back to the campfire, the hairs on my neck prickling as I set the wood down and stoked the fire. That was when I heard it again. A snap. Not from the trees this time, but from the ground behind me. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but once again, there was nothing there. I grabbed my knife, just in case, but my mind was racing. What could it be? An animal? No, the footsteps had been too heavy for that. It was almost human. The thought sent a cold wave of fear over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting. The rest of the night passed in a blur of tension. I stayed close to the fire, barely moving, listening for any sound. The forest seemed to be holding its breath, and I could feel every passing moment weighing heavier on my chest. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I was still alive, still in one piece. Nothing had attacked, Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, I told myself. Maybe I was just imagining things. I packed up my gear quickly, not wanting to linger a moment longer than necessary. As I was rolling up my tent, I noticed something strange. The ground near the fire pit, where I had been sitting all night, was disturbed. The leaves and dirt were kicked up, as if something had been pacing around my campsite. I froze, my blood running cold as I knelt down to examine it more closely. There were tracks in the dirt, deep and heavy, like boots, but too large, too unnatural. I didn't know what it was, but the fear I had felt the night before rushed back in full force. I didn't wait to figure it out. I grabbed my things and left the site in a hurry. I never went back to that campsite, and every time I venture out into the woods now, I keep my distance from places that feel too quiet. The forest is a place of beauty, but there are things out there that we aren't meant to understand. Things that move in the dark, waiting for the moment when we let our guard down. I could see the road in my rearview mirror getting narrower as I drove deeper into the woods. The rental truck rattled along the dirt path, tires spitting dust behind me. This was exactly what I needed. Solitude, quiet, and a break from the constant noise of life back in the city. I had planned this camping trip for months, choosing a spot far away from the usual crowded sites. This wasn't some well-maintained national park with rangers nearby. This was deep wilderness, a remote area where few people dared to go. I parked at the end of the trail, pulling out the map to double-check my route. From here, it would be a 6-mile hike to the lake where I planned to set up camp. It was late afternoon, and I wanted to reach the spot before sunset. I packed my gear, locked the truck, and started the trek. The forest was thick with towering pines, their trunks stretching high into the sky, casting long shadows. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles, a scent that brought back childhood memories of camping with my father. The sound of birds echoed through the trees, their calls growing fainter as I moved deeper into the wilderness. The first few miles were easy. The trail was well-defined, and the terrain was mostly flat. But as I got closer to my destination, the path became rugged. Roots jutted out from the ground, rocks made each step uneven, and the incline grew steeper. Sweat clung to my skin despite the cool air. I adjusted the straps of my backpack and pushed forward, my eyes scanning the area ahead. Then I saw it, a tent. It was off the trail, partially hidden behind a cluster of trees. A small orange tent, weathered and sagging. My first instinct was to ignore it. People camped in remote areas all the time, but something about it felt wrong. There was no sign of a fire pit, no scattered gear, no movement. The tent looked abandoned. I hesitated, then stepped closer. The ground around the tent was disturbed, as if someone had moved through it in a hurry. The flap was unzipped, hanging open. I leaned in just enough to see inside. Empty. No sleeping bag, no food, nothing. Just an old, stained tarp on the ground. I stepped back, glancing around the trees, listening. The wind rustled the leaves, but there were no voices, no footsteps, just silence. I decided to keep moving. It wasn't my business, and I had miles to go before reaching the lake. By the time I arrived, the sun had dipped behind the hills, casting the water in a dim, golden glow. The lake was still, its surface smooth as glass. I found a flat clearing near the shore and set up my tent. The process was automatic. Unroll the sleeping bag, unpack the food, gather firewood. Soon, a small fire crackled in front of me, sending up thin wisps of smoke. As I sat by the fire, eating my packed meal, I thought about the tent I had seen earlier. There had been something unsettling about it, something I couldn't shake, but I forced myself to push it from my mind. I was out here to enjoy the solitude, not spook myself with strange thoughts. Night fell, and the forest became a different world. The darkness was thick, pressing in from all sides. The only light came from my fire and the moon reflecting off the lake. I could hear the occasional rustling in the underbrush, probably a raccoon or some small animal. Nothing unusual. Then a sound, distant but distinct, a crunching of leaves. Slow, deliberate. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. It wasn't the random movement of an animal. This was different. Human footsteps. I turned my head slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing, just darkness. The fire crackled beside me, and for the first time, I felt exposed. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and aimed it towards the woods. Nothing. I told myself it was just paranoia, the isolation playing tricks on me, but the unease in my stomach didn't fade. I decided to turn in for the night. I made sure the fire was contained, zipped up my tent, and laid down, listening to the night sounds. My body was tired, but my mind wouldn't rest. Hours passed. Then I heard it again, closer this time. A branch snapped, the sound sharp in the silence. I held my breath, my ears straining. The footsteps were slow, careful, circling the campsite. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. I wanted to believe it was an animal, but deep down I knew better. Something or someone was out there. I laid there perfectly still, waiting. Then silence. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. No more footsteps, no more sounds. My eyelids grew heavy, exhaustion finally pulling me under. When I woke, the sun was rising, its golden light filtering through the trees. My fire had burned out, leaving only blackened wood and ashes. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, trying to shake the uneasy feeling from the night before. Then I saw them. Footprints. Clear, deep footprints in the dirt around my tent. Not animal tracks. Human. Barefoot. I scrambled out of the tent, my pulse pounding. The prints led from the tree line, circled my campsite, then disappeared back into the woods. Someone had been here, watching me. I packed my things quickly, every movement fueled by adrenaline. I had planned to stay another night, but I wasn't going to take any chances. By the time I started the hike back, the forest no longer felt peaceful. Every rustle, every shadow sent my nerves on edge. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me. I reached the truck in record time, throwing my gear into the back and jumping inside. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the dirt road, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. I didn't stop until I was miles away, until the thick trees gave way to open road and the safety of civilization. Even now, I don't know who was out there that night. A lost hiker? Some drifter living in the woods? Or something worse? All I know is that I'll never go back. And if you ever find an empty tent deep in the forest, do yourself a favor. Leave it alone. The drive up to the campsite was longer than I expected. I followed the winding roads, weaving through the dense forest, the tall pine trees swallowing up the last bit of daylight. I wanted to reach my campsite before dark, but the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the gravel road. I was alone, just me and my truck, heading deep into the wilderness for a weekend of solitude. I had done trips like this before, but something about this one felt different. Not bad, just off. I pushed the feeling aside. I finally reached the clearing where I planned to set up camp. The area was remote, tucked away from the main trails, exactly what I was looking for. I parked my truck near the tree line, killed the engine, and stepped out. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the smell of damp earth and pine. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant call of an owl. I set up my tent near a large fallen log and started a small fire. The warmth felt good against the evening chill. After heating up a can of chili and eating straight from the tin, I stretched out in my camping chair, staring into the flames. It was peaceful. The silence out here was unlike anything in the city. No cars, no voices, just the occasional crackling of burning wood. I felt my muscles relax. This was what I had come for. Solitude, stillness. But as I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It was subtle, just a nagging awareness in the back of my mind, like being watched. Every so often, I'd glance into the darkness beyond my fire's reach, half expecting to see something standing there. Of course, there was nothing, just trees and darkness. I ignored it and went about my routine. After putting out the fire and securing my food away from my tent to avoid attracting animals, I crawled into my sleeping bag. The forest was eerily quiet now. No wind, no chirping insects, just an unsettling silence that pressed against me like a thick blanket. I told myself it was just my imagination. I had camped alone plenty of times. This was normal. At some point in the night, I woke up. Something had snapped me out of sleep. I lay still, straining my ears. There it was, a sound. Faint, distant, crunching, like footsteps on dried leaves. My heartbeat picked up. I stayed completely still, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. Deliberate steps, slow and careful. I held my breath. Could be an animal. A deer, maybe, but the steps were too steady, too controlled. Not the erratic movements of a foraging animal. I reached slowly for the knife I kept beside my sleeping bag, my fingers tightening around the handle. The footsteps stopped, just outside my tent. A long pause, silence, then the unmistakable sound of breathing. Not the heavy snorts of a bear, not the sharp sniffing of a coyote. Human, steady, controlled. Someone was standing outside my tent. I didn't move. My mind raced through my options. If I made a noise, would they leave? If I stayed quiet, would they try to come inside? My truck was parked a few yards away, but getting to it would mean unzipping the tent, making noise, exposing myself. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the breathing stopped. Another pause. Then, footsteps again, moving away this time, fading into the distance. I stayed frozen for what felt like an eternity, gripping my knife so tight my hand ached. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. When the sun finally rose, I hesitated before unzipping my tent. Stepping outside, the forest felt different in the daylight. Less menacing, but not entirely safe. I checked around my campsite, searching for any sign that someone had been there. Nothing. No footprints, no disturbances. I told myself I had imagined it. Maybe I had dreamed the whole thing. I forced myself to shake it off and went about my day, hiking a nearby trail and gathering more firewood. As the afternoon stretched on, I felt better. The daylight had a way of making things feel normal again. I convinced myself to stay another night. That evening, as I sat by the fire, I couldn't shake the memory of last night. The breathing, the footsteps. I told myself it had been a lone hiker passing through. Maybe they saw my tent and decided to check if someone was inside. Still, something didn't sit right with me. As the fire died down, I locked my truck doors, just in case, and crawled into my tent. Sleep didn't come easy. Every little sound had me wide awake. But nothing happened that night. No footsteps, no breathing. When morning came, I felt a little foolish. I packed up my camp, loaded my gear into the truck, and got ready to leave. But just before I got into the driver's seat, something caught my eye. About 20 feet from my campsite, carved into the trunk of a tree, was a single word: watching. My stomach dropped. The letters were fresh, the cuts in the bark raw. Someone had been here. Someone had stood outside my tent and then, at some point, had taken the time to carve that word into the tree. And I had never heard them do it. I got into my truck and started the engine, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. As I drove away, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave. I never camped alone again. I drove out to the woods just before sunset, the back of my truck packed with supplies. A tent, a sleeping bag, enough food and water to last 3 days. I had planned this trip for months, waiting for the perfect weekend to disconnect from everything. No cell service, no noise, no people. Just me and the wilderness. The drive took longer than expected, the dirt road winding through dense trees, the headlights of my truck barely cutting through the darkness as night crept in. I found a clearing about a mile from the main road, far enough to be alone but close enough that I could get back if I needed to. The air smelled like damp leaves and pine, the ground soft under my boots as I stepped out and stretched my legs. I set up my tent quickly, rolling out my sleeping bag inside before gathering some firewood. The silence was thick, only broken by the occasional chirp of crickets or the rustling of small animals in the brush. The fire crackled as I sat down, the warmth cutting through the night's chill. Eating my dinner felt strangely satisfying out here. Simple things always tasted better in the wild. I leaned back against a log, staring up at the sky. The stars were sharp and bright, untouched by city lights. Then I heard it, a crunch. Not the sound of a small animal, not the rustling of wind through branches. A deliberate step, something heavy pressing into the earth. I froze, listening. Nothing. I told myself it was my imagination. The woods were full of sounds, full of movement. It was probably a deer, maybe even a bear sniffing around. I forced myself to relax, but my senses stayed sharp, ears tuned to every tiny noise. I stayed up longer than I planned, feeding the fire just to keep the darkness at bay. I didn't like how exposed I felt in that clearing, the trees pressing in from all sides. But eventually, my body gave in to exhaustion. I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and let sleep take me. I woke up suddenly. My eyes snapped open, my body frozen before my mind could even register what had startled me awake. Something was outside my tent. I listened, heart pounding, breathing, slow, steady, too steady. I turned my head slowly, careful not to make a sound. My tent was thin, just a thin layer of fabric separating me from whatever was out there. The breathing grew softer, then stopped. I strained my ears, waiting. Then, a soft, deliberate exhale, right at the entrance of my tent. I couldn't move. My muscles locked up, my body trapped between fight and flight. Then silence. Long, unbearable silence. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. 15. I counted the seconds in my head, forcing myself to breathe quietly. Nothing happened. Eventually, my body gave in. I didn't sleep, but I stayed still, waiting for the first hint of daylight. Morning came slow, the world outside my tent washed in pale gray light. I unzipped the flap carefully, peeking out. Nothing seemed disturbed. My fire was out, my supplies untouched. No footprints. I told myself it had been my imagination, maybe the wind playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I made breakfast, trying to push the fear aside. The woods felt different now, less inviting. I considered packing up, but the stubborn part of me refused to leave. I wasn't going to let some weird noise scare me off. I spent the day hiking, trying to shake the unease. The woods stretched for miles, dense with towering trees and thick undergrowth. But no matter how far I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. When I returned to my campsite that evening, I stopped cold. Something was off. My tent had been unzipped. Not torn, not damaged, just unzipped. Open. I felt a wave of cold roll through me. Had I forgotten to close it? No. I was sure I had zipped it shut before leaving. I scanned the area, looking for footprints, any sign that someone or something had been here. The ground was undisturbed, the leaves still in place. I felt exposed, vulnerable. Still, I forced myself to stay. I rebuilt the fire, making it bigger this time, brighter, as if the flames could keep whatever was out there at bay. I ate quickly, listening to the woods around me. Every snap of a twig, every shift of the wind made my skin crawl. Then, as the last light of the sun disappeared, I saw it. Just beyond the firelight, deep in the trees. Watching. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The eyes stayed there for what felt like hours, unblinking, unshifting. Then, slowly, they disappeared. I didn't sleep that night. By dawn, I had made up my mind. I packed up my tent, throwing everything into the back of my truck. My gut told me to get out, and I wasn't about to ignore it. As I started the engine, I glanced back one last time. And there, just at the tree line, something stood. Not an animal, not a person, something in between, watching me. I didn't stay to find out what it was. I drove away, faster than I should have, not looking back again. I don't go camping anymore. I had been planning the trip for months. A solo camping adventure deep in the Montana wilderness, far from the reach of cell towers and crowded trails. It was something I had always wanted to do. Completely disconnect from the modern world, test myself against nature, and enjoy the solitude that only true wilderness could offer. I packed everything meticulously. A sturdy tent, a reliable sleeping bag, enough food for 5 days, a first aid kit, my hunting knife, and a well-worn map. I left my phone in my truck at the trailhead, deciding I wanted nothing electronic interfering with the experience. The hike in was brutal. The terrain was uneven, filled with thick underbrush and fallen logs, making each step a test of balance. I followed an old, unmarked path I had read about in a forum for experienced hikers, a route so rarely traveled that nature had almost reclaimed it. By the time I reached the valley where I planned to set up camp, my shoulders ached from the weight of my pack, and my legs burned from the steep inclines. But the view made it all worth it. The valley stretched out like something from a postcard, flanked by towering pines and jagged cliffs. A narrow stream cut through the middle, its water clear and fast-moving. I could already picture myself filling my bottle there, washing my face in the cold mountain water every morning. Setting up camp was routine. I found a flat patch of ground not too far from the stream, cleared away the twigs and rocks, and pitched my tent. I made sure to hang my food high in a tree away from camp. Bears were a real concern out here. As the sun dipped below the mountains, I got a small fire going, cooked a simple meal, and sat back to take in the silence. No traffic, no distant hum of civilization. Just the wind rustling the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. That first night was peaceful. I slept deeply, wrapped in my sleeping bag, my body exhausted from the hike. When I woke up, the morning air was crisp, and the sky was a brilliant blue. I spent the day exploring, wandering further into the wilderness, finding animal tracks in the damp earth and the remnants of an old hunter's cabin long since abandoned. Everything felt untouched, pure. I was alone out here, just as I had hoped. On the second night, things changed. I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding, though I had no idea why at first. Then I heard it, something moving just outside my tent. Slow, deliberate steps. My first thought was a bear, but the sound wasn't heavy enough. It was quieter, more measured. I held my breath, listening. Whatever it was, it moved around my campsite, circling. My mind raced through possibilities. A deer, maybe? A coyote? But something about the movement felt off. Too controlled, too steady. I lay there, gripping my knife, afraid to move. Eventually, the footsteps faded into the distance, and I forced myself to relax, though my sleep for the rest of the night was shallow and restless. By morning, I convinced myself I had overreacted. The woods are full of noises, and I was alone. Maybe I was just on edge. Still, I checked the area around my tent for tracks. The ground was disturbed, but whatever had been there hadn't left any clear prints. It was unsettling, but I shook it off and spent the day fishing at the stream, trying to enjoy myself. That night, it happened again. This time, I was certain something was out there watching. The sound of footsteps returned, the same slow, careful pacing. I wanted to call out, to shine my flashlight outside, but a deep, primal instinct told me not to. Instead, I sat in the darkness, my knife clutched tightly, and waited. The steps stopped right outside my tent. I could hear breathing, slow, controlled, almost human. Then, after what felt like an eternity, it moved away, back into the forest. I barely slept. The moment the first hint of daylight appeared, I packed up my camp. I wasn't about to stick around to find out what was stalking me. I moved fast, following my map back toward the trailhead. Every rustling leaf made me jump. Every distant snap of a branch set my nerves on edge. I felt watched, like something was just beyond the trees, shadowing my every step. Then I found the footprints, not an animal's, human, barefoot. They were faint in some places, more pronounced in others, but they followed my path, weaving in and out of the trees. Some were fresh, my stomach twisted. Someone had been out there, in the middle of nowhere, walking barefoot through the forest, circling my camp at night. I pushed forward, my legs burning, my heart hammering. The forest felt darker, more oppressive, as if it was closing in on me. Every step felt like a lifetime. I wasn't just hiking out anymore. I was fleeing. When I finally reached my truck, I nearly collapsed against the door. I scrambled to unlock it, my hands shaking. Once inside, I locked every door, started the engine, and sped down the dirt road without looking back. It wasn't until I got home that I let myself really think about it. Someone had been out there, miles from any marked trail, watching me, following me. I had been completely alone, or so I had thought. I don't camp alone anymore. I never liked camping. I wasn't one of those kids who grew up spending summers in the woods, roasting marshmallows, telling stories by a fire. I was the type who preferred solid walls, locked doors, and the sound of distant traffic rather than the eerie silence of nature. But somehow, I let myself get talked into a solo camping trip. It started as a challenge. I had friends who hiked, fished, and camped all the time, and they were always saying I wouldn't last a single night out in the wild. They were probably right, but I was stubborn, and stubbornness gets people into bad situations. I decided I'd go alone, just for a couple of nights, to prove to myself that I could do it. I picked a spot deep in a national forest, far away from any official campsites. I wanted to be alone, away from other people. I didn't want some guy in an RV blasting music or a family with kids ruining the experience. I wanted silence, space, and nothing but trees around me. The first mistake was underestimating how deep into the forest I had gone. I parked my car at a small gravel pull-off near an old trailhead. There were no signs, no maps, just a narrow path leading into the trees. I had planned it all out beforehand, marked my route on my phone's GPS, packed all the essentials: food, water, a small tent, a knife, a flashlight, extra batteries. I thought I had everything covered. The hike in was harder than I expected. The trail was barely visible, overgrown with thick roots and damp, rotting leaves. The deeper I went, the more I felt like I was walking into a place where people weren't supposed to be. The trees grew closer together, blocking out the light. It was late afternoon when I finally found a clearing big enough for my tent. Setting up camp took longer than it should have. The ground was uneven, covered in a layer of thick pine needles. The air smelled of wet earth and decaying wood. I built a small fire, ate a protein bar, and tried to enjoy the solitude. It wasn't bad at first. The fire crackled. The sky turned a deep purple as the sun set, and for a moment, I thought maybe I had been wrong to hate camping. Then I heard it. At first, it was just a noise, something moving in the trees. I figured it was an animal, deer maybe, or a raccoon. I told myself not to be paranoid. I wasn't used to these sounds. My brain was just on high alert, picking up every rustling leaf and snapping twig. I forced myself to relax, but the noise didn't stop. It wasn't random. It had a pattern. A few steps, then silence. A few more steps, silence again. I turned off my flashlight, letting the fire be the only light source. My eyes adjusted to the dark, scanning the trees. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Something was out there, watching. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear something. Something too heavy to be a small animal. Something that seemed to circle my campsite, moving in slow, deliberate steps. Morning came, and I convinced myself I had imagined it. I was just jumpy, not used to the isolation. The daylight made everything seem normal again. I packed up my things, hiked a little farther into the woods, and set up a new camp in a different spot. That was my second mistake. The second night was worse. The noises came back earlier this time, before the sun had even fully set. I was eating when I heard the first snap of a branch in the distance. I stopped, listening, heart pounding. Then another snap, closer. I picked up my flashlight, aimed it into the trees. Nothing, just darkness. I tried to eat, but I wasn't hungry anymore. My stomach was tight, my body tense. I felt exposed, sitting by the fire, vulnerable. The feeling of being watched was stronger now. I had never felt anything like it before. It wasn't just paranoia, it was real. Something was out there. I told myself I'd pack up and leave first thing in the morning. I should have left right then. The third mistake was waiting. I barely slept again. Every sound put me on edge. My knife was in my hand the entire night, gripped so tightly my fingers ached by morning. When the sun rose, I wasted no time. I stuffed everything into my backpack, put out the fire, and started hiking back the way I had come. The forest was different now. Or maybe I was just seeing it differently. The trees seemed thicker, the trail harder to follow. I checked my GPS, still on track. But the unease never left me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something following me. But there was nothing, just the trees, stretching endlessly in every direction. Then I found the first footprint. It wasn't mine. It was fresh, bigger than my boot, deep in the mud, like whoever made it was heavier than me. I stopped, my breath caught in my throat. Then I saw the second one, and the third. Whoever had been out there at night wasn't just passing through. They had been following me. I walked faster. Then I started running. The forest felt endless. My legs ached. My lungs burned, but I didn't stop. I didn't care if I tripped, if I dropped something. I just needed to get out. Finally, I saw it, the break in the trees where I had parked. My car. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the keys out of my pocket. I fumbled with the lock, jumped in, and slammed the door shut. I didn't stop shaking until I was miles away. I don't know who or what was out there with me. I never went back to check. I deleted the GPS route. I didn't tell anyone the full story, but I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone in those woods, and I never will be again. I always thought of myself as a capable outdoorsman. I grew up hiking, fishing, setting up tents in my backyard just to practice. I knew how to navigate with a compass, how to read animal tracks, and how to build a fire in the worst conditions. So when I planned a solo camping trip deep in the forests of northern Montana, I didn't feel nervous. I felt prepared. The plan was simple. Drive up to the trailhead, hike about 12 miles into the backcountry, and set up camp by a small, isolated lake that I had read about in a forum. It wasn't on any major map, just a little blue speck I had found on a satellite image. The thought of being out there alone, away from everything, was exactly what I wanted. The first few hours of hiking were peaceful. The trail was mostly overgrown, barely used, but I had my GPS, my paper map, and a good sense of direction. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, the way it always does after a recent rain. The ground was soft, my boots sinking slightly into the mud, but nothing too difficult. As I got deeper into the forest, I started noticing things that were off. The first thing was the silence. At first, I didn't think much of it. Sometimes the woods are quiet, but after a while, I realized I hadn't heard a single bird, no rustling in the underbrush, not even the distant howl of wind through the trees. Just dead, heavy silence. Then there were the trees. Some of them had strange gashes, deep cuts running down their trunks. Not the kind that an animal makes. These were precise, deliberate, almost like someone had taken an axe and hacked at them, but not all the way through. Just enough to leave a mark. I stopped to examine one, running my fingers over the splintered wood. It was fresh. A little further in, I found something else. Pile of bones. Not scattered like an animal kill, but stacked, arranged. Small bones, maybe from rabbits or squirrels, all placed in a neat pile at the base of a tree. I stared at them for a long time. This wasn't natural. I had seen predator kills before. This wasn't that. Someone had put them there. I kept going. The lake wasn't far now, and turning back would mean a long hike in the dark. That wasn't an option. When I finally reached the clearing, the lake was exactly as I had seen in the satellite images. Still, quiet, untouched. The water was dark, reflecting the trees that loomed around it. The sky had started turning shades of orange and pink, and I knew I had to set up quickly. As I unpacked, I couldn't shake the unease settling in my stomach. I had camped alone before, but this was different. There was something wrong with this place, but I forced myself to keep moving. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and made a quick meal. As night fell, I sat by the fire, listening to the stillness, waiting for the usual nighttime sounds of the forest to return. They never did. Then, just as I was about to turn in for the night, I heard it. Footsteps. Not the quick, darting sounds of an animal, but slow, deliberate steps, moving through the trees behind my tent. I froze, every muscle in my body going rigid. I had my knife in my hand before I even realized I had reached for it. The footsteps stopped, just outside the firelight. I strained my ears, trying to hear if whatever it was had moved. Nothing. The silence stretched. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, each beat loud in my ears. I told myself it was my imagination, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. I stayed awake for hours, staring at the trees, gripping my knife so tight my knuckles ached. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off. I woke to the sound of movement just outside my tent. My fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting just enough light for me to see the silhouette of someone, standing just beyond the clearing. Tall, still, watching. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My knife was still in my hand, but I knew it wouldn't do much if whoever this was had a weapon. I stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, staring, waiting, heart pounding. Then, slowly, the figure turned and walked back into the trees. No rush, no fear, like they had all the time in the world. I didn't sleep after that. As soon as the first light of dawn touched the treetops, I packed my gear and left. I didn't eat. I didn't even take down my tent. I just grabbed my pack and started walking, fast. The entire hike back, I felt watched. The feeling never left. Even when I reached my car, even when I locked the doors and sped down the dirt road, it stayed with me. That night, back at home, I locked every door, every window. I checked them twice, 3 times. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I know one thing for certain. I was not alone in those woods. I didn't think much about the trip when I first planned it. Just a weekend in the woods, a break from the noise of the city, the stress of work, the constant notifications on my phone. I picked a remote location, a national forest a few hours' drive from home, the kind of place where you don't see another person for miles. That's what I wanted. I packed light, a tent, a sleeping bag, a small gas stove, enough food for 3 days. I had a good knife, a fire starter, and a small hatchet just in case. I wasn't a complete amateur. I'd been camping a few times before, but never alone. Still, I felt prepared. I checked the weather, no storms on the forecast. I told a friend where I was going just in case. The drive was peaceful, roads winding through thick forests, no other cars in sight for long stretches. I reached the trailhead by mid-afternoon, parked my car, and started hiking. My pack wasn't too heavy, and the trail was well marked at first. After about an hour, I veered off the main trail. I wanted solitude, so I had picked a spot far from the usual campsites. I had studied the map carefully, found a small clearing near a creek about 4 miles in. It wasn't an official campsite, but it was flat, close to water, and far enough from any roads that I wouldn't hear a single car. It took me another 2 hours to get there. The last stretch was tough. No real trail, just pushing through underbrush and stepping over fallen logs. But when I reached the clearing, it was worth it. The creek ran steady and clear, surrounded by tall trees. The ground was soft with pine needles. I set up camp quickly. Tent up, firewood gathered, a small fire going before dark. I cooked a simple meal, canned soup heated on my stove. I ate by the fire, listening to the forest. It was quiet, that deep, heavy quiet you only get in the wild. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, no airplanes overhead, just the crackle of the fire, the occasional rustle of leaves. Then, as the sun dipped below the trees, I heard something, a branch snapping, not the soft crack of a twig breaking under a squirrel's weight, but the solid snap of something heavy. I froze, listening. Nothing. Maybe a deer, or a bear. I knew there were black bears in the area, but they usually avoided people. I had my bear spray close just in case. I stayed still for a long time, listening. The fire crackled. The creek bubbled. The wind stirred the trees. Nothing else. After a while, I forced myself to relax. I put more wood on the fire, stared into the flames. I convinced myself I was being paranoid. I was alone out here, completely alone. I went to my tent a little after 10. The fire was low but still burning. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, the fabric crinkling loudly in the silence. The ground was cold beneath me. I closed my eyes. Sometime in the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. I just knew something had changed. The fire was out, total darkness around me. I lay still, heart pounding. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, close. Not an animal. Animals move in bursts, quick and light. These were human. Steady, careful. Just outside my tent. My breath caught in my throat. My mind raced. I hadn't seen a single person since I left the car. Who would be out here? The footsteps stopped. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. My other hand found the zipper of the tent. I held my breath, listened. Silence. Minutes passed. My muscles ached from holding still. Then, finally, I heard movement again, slow steps, retreating this time, moving away into the woods. I waited a long time before I moved. My fingers were stiff around the knife handle. I listened until I couldn't hear anything but the normal sounds of the forest. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I crawled out of the tent. Everything looked the same. My gear was untouched. No footprints in the soft dirt. But I knew what I had heard. I packed up fast. Didn't eat, didn't even make coffee. Just shoved everything into my pack and started hiking back the way I came. The forest felt different now. Every snap of a twig made my skin crawl. I walked fast, almost jogging, but I kept my knife in my hand the whole time. When I reached my car, I nearly collapsed from relief. I tossed my gear in the back, locked the doors as soon as I was inside. My hands shook as I started the engine. I didn't look back as I drove away. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone, and they knew exactly where I was. I don't know what made me think camping alone was a good idea. Maybe I just wanted to escape the noise of the city, the constant hum of traffic, the glow of streetlights seeping through my apartment windows. I wanted silence, real silence, the kind you only get in the deep woods, where the only sounds are the wind through the trees and the distant calls of animals you'll never see. I chose a spot deep in the national forest, miles away from the nearest town, a place where cell service was non-existent, where the only way in or out was a dirt road barely wide enough for my truck. I packed everything carefully: tent, sleeping bag, enough food for a few days, a hunting knife, a first aid kit, a small axe for firewood. I wasn't new to camping, but this was the first time I was doing it alone. That part excited me more than it scared me, at least at first. I arrived in the late afternoon. The sun was still high, but it cast long shadows through the trees. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. I found a clearing near a small creek, a perfect spot. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and settled in before it got dark. Night came fast in the forest. The silence I had been craving was overwhelming now, a thick kind of quiet that pressed in on me. The fire crackled, the only source of light against the darkness. I ate my dinner, just some canned beans heated over the flames, then sat back, staring into the fire. That's when I noticed it. A sound, distant at first but getting closer. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving through the underbrush. I held my breath, listening. Could have been an animal, but the steps were too steady. Not the quick, erratic movement of a deer or the scurry of a raccoon. This was something walking, something aware of me. I reached for my knife, my pulse pounding. The footsteps stopped. The silence stretched on longer than it should have. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. Still, I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, I found footprints. Human footprints in the damp soil near my campsite. They weren't mine. I had been wearing heavy boots, but these were barefoot. Long, narrow prints with toes spread wide. They circled my tent, stopping just a few feet from where I had been sleeping. A chill ran through me. Someone had been here, watching me. I looked around, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. I had no idea how long they had been standing there, how long they had been listening to me breathe as I slept. I considered leaving, but part of me didn't want to give in to fear. Could have been some drifter passing through, maybe even another camper who got too close. I decided to stay, but I kept my knife on me at all times. That day passed uneventfully. I explored the woods, staying close to my camp, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every time I turned, I felt like I was being watched. The trees seemed too still, the air too quiet. No birds, no insects, just silence. That night, I barely slept. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me gripping my knife tighter. At some point, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. Then I woke up to breathing, not my own. Deep, slow breathing, just outside my tent. My heart stopped. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. It was close, so close I could hear the exhale, the way it caught slightly, like whoever it was had a dry throat. My fingers tightened around the knife handle. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the breathing stopped. I stayed awake until dawn, my body rigid, my mind racing. When the sun came up, I unzipped the tent slowly, peering outside. Nothing. No footprints this time. No sign that anyone had been there at all. But I knew better. I packed up my gear quickly. I wasn't staying another night. As I loaded my truck, I felt it again, that pressure of being watched. I turned sharply, scanning the trees, and then I saw it. A figure, barely visible between the trees. Tall, thin, motionless. Too far to make out a face, but close enough that I knew it was watching me. I didn't wait. I got in my truck and drove, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see if it was following me. I don't know who or what it was. Maybe just some lunatic living off the grid. Someone who didn't like strangers in their woods. Maybe something worse. I don't care. I'll never go back to that place. And I'll never camp alone again. I had planned this camping trip for weeks. 3 days alone in the wilderness. Away from the noise of the city, away from my job, away from everything. Just me, my tent, and nature. I had done my research, picked a remote but safe spot near a river, checked the weather, packed everything I'd need: food, water, first aid, a knife, a flashlight, extra batteries, even a small hatchet for firewood. I wasn't an expert camper, but I wasn't clueless either. I knew enough to stay safe. The first day went exactly as planned. I set up my tent near the tree line, but with enough clearing to see the sky. The river was about 50 yards away, a steady stream of clean, clear water. I fished a little, cooked over a small fire, and spent the evening watching the stars. It was peaceful, quiet, perfect. The second day, things started feeling off. It wasn't anything big, just small things. I woke up to find my firewood pile knocked over. Not scattered, not like an animal had rummaged through it, just knocked over, like someone had brushed their foot against it. I figured maybe I had stacked it poorly the night before and let it go. Then, around midday, I went down to the river to fill my water bottle. I knew exactly where I had left it. I had placed it on a flat rock near the edge. But when I got there, it was gone. I looked around, thinking maybe I had misremembered. But no, it wasn't there. I checked my tent. Not there either. Eventually, I found it lying about 10 feet from the water, half buried in the dirt. I had no explanation for that. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe I had just been careless. But something about it didn't sit right with me. That night, I made sure to secure everything before bed. Firewood stacked neatly, gear packed inside my tent, even my boots tucked away under the rain flap. I double-checked everything, then crawled into my sleeping bag and tried to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. The forest was silent, too silent. I had spent enough time outdoors to know that the woods never go completely quiet. There's always something: crickets, owls, the rustling of leaves in the wind. But that night, nothing. It was as if the whole forest was holding its breath. I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, listening, staring at the thin fabric of my tent, expecting to see a shadow pass by. But nothing happened. Not yet. The third day was worse. I had this feeling, this overwhelming sensation of being watched. I tried to shake it off, but it clung to me, made my skin crawl. I decided to leave early. I packed up my gear in record time and started hiking back to my car, following the same trail I had taken in. But something was wrong. The trail looked different. I know that sounds stupid. It was the same dirt path, the same trees, but something was off. Couldn't explain it, but it felt unfamiliar. I walked faster. Then, about an hour in, I noticed something. Footprints. Not mine. They were fresh, pressed deep into the dirt, and they were going in the same direction as me. At first, I thought maybe they were from another camper, but the more I looked, the less sense they made. The stride was too long, the impressions too deep, like whoever left them was bigger, heavier, and moving fast. Panic started setting in. I picked up my pace, trying to ignore the pounding in my chest. The footprints didn't stop. They stayed with me, always just ahead, as if whoever made them was just out of sight, keeping the same pace as me. Then I saw it. Piece of my rope. The one I had used to tie my food up in a tree the night before. It was lying in the middle of the path, cut clean through. My stomach dropped. Someone had been at my campsite. Someone had been watching me. I stopped moving, listened. Nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing, too loud in the stillness of the forest. Then snap. A twig breaking somewhere behind me. I turned so fast I nearly tripped. Nothing. But I knew I wasn't alone. I ran. I didn't think, didn't look back, just ran. My pack was heavy, my legs burned, but I didn't stop. I didn't slow down until I saw my car, sitting right where I had left it. The sight of it was almost enough to make me cry. I yanked the keys from my pocket with shaking hands, threw my gear in the back, and peeled out of there so fast my tires kicked up dirt and gravel. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the highway, surrounded by other cars, other people. Only then did I let myself breathe. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I know this, someone was watching me. Someone followed me. And if I had stayed just one more night, I don't think I would have made it out. The day I decided to go camping by myself was supposed to be a quiet retreat from the noise of everyday life. I had planned it for weeks, looking forward to escaping the constant buzz of the city. I was looking for peace, some time alone to reflect, to think, and maybe to figure out some of the mess in my life. I wasn't expecting anything unusual, just some time in nature, away from the chaos. I packed my gear: a sturdy tent, a sleeping bag, a camping stove, food, and enough water to last me for a couple of days. I left early in the morning, eager to get to the campsite. The drive out to the wilderness was long, the kind of drive where the roads stretch on, and the world around you seems to disappear. As I passed the last small town, I felt a sense of liberation. I was out of reach of everything. The open road was all I had, and the feeling was good. I arrived at the trailhead around noon. The air was crisp, the sky a bright blue with only a few puffy clouds scattered across. The trail was quiet. A few other cars were parked along the road, but there weren't many people around. I liked it that way. I grabbed my backpack and started walking into the woods. The hike was about an hour to the campsite I had picked out. It was located near a small stream, surrounded by trees and not too far from a ridge that gave a nice view of the valley below. I'd done my research, read reviews from others who had camped there before, and everything seemed perfect. Nothing too remote, but still far enough to feel like I was truly out in the wild. Setting up my tent was quick, and once I was done, I went to gather some firewood. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, and the shadows grew longer. It wasn't dark yet, but the quiet was already starting to set in, and I couldn't help but notice how still everything was. There were no birds calling, no squirrels chattering, not even a breeze rustling the leaves. It was unnervingly silent. I brushed it off, though. I'd been hiking for a while, and my body was aching, so I focused on making sure the fire was ready to go for when the evening chill set in. As night began to fall, I started the fire and sat by it, watching the flames dance. The crackling of the wood was the only sound, and for a while it was calming. I heated up a can of chili I had brought and ate slowly, savoring the warmth. Afterward, I leaned back against a tree and looked up at the stars. There was no light pollution out here, and the night sky was breathtaking. I found myself getting lost in the constellations. Then that's when I first heard it. At first, it was just a faint sound in the distance, like a twig snapping. I froze, my body going rigid. Could have been an animal, I thought. Probably a deer or something. But then there was another sound, closer this time, like footsteps on the forest floor. I tried to dismiss it. There were other campers around. It could have been someone else out for a walk. But the longer I listened, the more I felt the unease creeping in. The footsteps were getting closer, and I could hear the faint rustling of leaves. I stood up, heart hammering in my chest. I looked around the camp, the firelight flickering and casting long shadows. There was no one in sight. I wasn't sure if it was the dark or the isolation that was making me paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I grabbed the flashlight from my backpack and shone it around the campsite. The beam of light pierced the darkness, but there was nothing. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It was probably nothing. But then the footsteps came again. This time they were closer, unmistakable. Someone was out there. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Slowly, I made my way to the edge of the camp, trying to peer into the darkness. I called out, my voice shaky. "Hello? Is someone there?" Nothing. Just silence, like the forest was holding its breath. I didn't know what to do. If it was a person, I didn't want to confront them alone. But if it was some animal, I didn't want to make noise and attract it either. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening, straining for any sign of movement. Eventually, the footsteps faded, and all I was left with was the eerie quiet of the woods. I decided to go back to the fire and try to forget about it. Maybe it was just the wind or an animal. I couldn't let myself get worked up over nothing. But as I sat back down, the fire crackling softly in front of me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The air felt heavy, and the silence felt oppressive, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I tried to stay calm, convincing myself that I was just tired, that I was imagining things. But every snap of a twig, every gust of wind that sent the trees swaying, made my heart race. I stayed up late that night, too afraid to sleep, my eyes darting toward every sound, waiting for something to emerge from the darkness. The next morning, I woke up stiff and exhausted. The sun had just risen, casting long shadows over the campsite. I could still feel the weight of the night's fear lingering in the back of my mind. The woods looked different in the daylight. What had seemed so peaceful and serene yesterday now felt more ominous. I packed up my things quickly, eager to get out of the woods. But as I was about to leave, something caught my eye. At the edge of my camp, near where I had set up my tent, there was a set of footprints. They were fresh, the dirt still soft from the night's moisture, and they led away from the camp, disappearing into the trees. The footprints were too big to be from an animal. Human footprints, barefoot, as if someone had walked right up to my camp in the middle of the night. My stomach dropped. There was no way I could have missed someone walking up to my tent. I would have heard them, but these prints were clear. Someone had been there, and I had no idea who or why. The idea of staying another night in that camp felt unbearable. I didn't even want to stick around to see who might come back. I hurriedly packed up the rest of my things and started down the trail, my mind racing with questions. Who had been out there, and why? I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that maybe it was just some lost hiker or someone who had wandered too close to my camp. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. As I reached the trailhead and finally stepped into the parking area, I felt a sense of relief. The car was in sight, the open road waiting. But as I walked toward it, I glanced over my shoulder, just for a second, to see if anyone else was coming down the trail. That's when I saw it. There, standing at the edge of the trees, was a figure. Person watching me. Their face was hidden in the shadows, but I could feel their eyes on me, cold and unblinking. My heart stopped. I turned quickly and got in my car, locking the doors before I even sat down. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, and I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from that place. The image of that figure still burned into my mind. It wasn't until I got home that I felt I could finally breathe again. Safe. I hadn't seen the person again, but the memory of their presence, of those footprints, would stay with me. Weeks passed, and the memory started to fade, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, still watching. The strange thing is, I never saw that figure again. But I found something in the mail one day, a single crumpled note with no return address. It was simple, just a few words written in block letters. Next time, don't leave so early. And I never went camping alone again. I've always loved camping. The quiet of the woods, the crisp night air, the way the trees sway like they're whispering secrets to each other. It was something I did often, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends. This time, it was just me. I wanted some solitude, a break from the noise of my daily life. I picked a spot deep in the national forest, away from the usual campgrounds. No cell service, no distractions. Just me, my tent, and the wilderness. I parked my truck at the edge of a dirt path, threw my pack over my shoulders, and started walking. The forest was dense, the canopy thick overhead, letting only slivers of sunlight through. I followed a game trail for about an hour before finding a small clearing near a slow-moving creek. It was perfect. Setting up camp was routine. I pitched my tent, gathered firewood, and made sure my food was stored properly to keep animals away. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I got a fire going and cooked a simple meal: beans and some jerky. Night came fast in the woods. The fire flickered, casting shadows that danced on the surrounding trees. The silence was different at night, heavier, like the woods were watching. I wasn't scared, though. I'd done this 100 times before. I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and listened to the sounds of the forest. The wind rustled the leaves, a small animal scurried through the underbrush, and the creek trickled softly nearby. Sleep came easy. Then, in the dead of night, I woke up. Something wasn't right. At first, I didn't move, just listened. The fire had burned down to embers, leaving only a faint orange glow. The forest was still, too still. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Not an animal. An animal moves with caution, pausing, sniffing, adjusting. These were human steps, steady, with purpose. I stayed completely still, my heart hammering in my chest. My tent was zipped up, but I could hear the footsteps circling my campsite. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. I reached slowly for my knife, gripping it tight. My gun was in my truck, too far away to be useful now. I kept listening, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped. Silence stretched out, the kind that makes your skin crawl. I stayed like that for what felt like an eternity. Then, after minutes that felt like hours, I heard the steps retreating, fading into the woods. I didn't move, not for a long time. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I dozed off, gripping my knife in my sleeping bag. Morning came slow. Sunlight trickled through the trees, and the world seemed normal again. I climbed out of my tent, stretched, and tried to shake off the unease from the night before. Maybe it had been another camper passing through, someone lost or looking for a spot. Maybe. I checked around the campsite. Nothing was disturbed. No footprints, no signs of anyone. I decided to shake it off, chalk it up to my imagination, and go about my day. The second night, it happened again. I was prepared this time. I kept my knife closer and made sure the fire stayed strong. But it didn't matter. The footsteps came again, slow, circling. I could hear breathing. Not deep, not loud. Just the faintest sound of someone exhaling, close enough that my skin prickled. Then, a new sound. A soft, deliberate tap on my tent. Just once, light, as if testing. I gripped my knife, forcing myself to stay still. The tapping didn't come again. But the footsteps continued, circling. And then nothing. Just like before, the presence faded into the woods. Morning couldn't come fast enough. I packed up, ready to leave, but something stopped me. A set of footprints just outside my tent. Larger than mine, barefoot. I didn't think. I just moved. I grabbed my pack, stomped out the fire, and started heading back toward my truck. But the woods had changed. The game trail I'd followed in was harder to find. The trees looked different, more tangled, closer together. I walked faster, my pulse pounding. Then I saw it. A small wooden structure, just off the trail. Not a cabin, more like a shack. I hadn't seen it before. It looked old, abandoned. The door hung slightly open. I should have ignored it. I should have kept walking. But my gut told me that whoever had been in my camp had come from here. I stepped closer. The smell hit me first. Rot, decay. The kind that gets into your nose and stays there. I pushed the door open wider. Inside, the walls were covered in old newspaper clippings. Missing persons reports. Dozens of them. Some from years ago, some more recent. And on the floor, a pile of clothes, dirty and torn. And then, in the center of the shack, a single Polaroid picture. Of me, taken the night before while I was sleeping in my tent. I ran. I didn't think, didn't look back. Just ran. The woods seemed endless, twisting. But I pushed through, heart slamming against my ribs. Branches cut my arms, my pack snagged. But I didn't stop. Then, finally, I saw my truck. I jumped in, locked the doors, and peeled out, my tires kicking up dirt. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I never went back. I never reported it. I told myself no one would believe me, that there was nothing to be done. But sometimes when I camp now, always in busy campgrounds, never alone, I wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I hear footsteps, and I wonder if whoever was out there that night ever found someone else. I still think about that night whenever I'm alone in the woods. The way the air felt too still, the way the silence stretched too long, the way something unseen moved just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I tell myself it was nothing, but deep down, I know that's a lie. It started as a simple weekend trip. Just me, my pack, and the deep woods. I wanted to escape the world for a while, to clear my head and test myself against nature. I picked a spot far from any trails, deep in a forest where the trees grew thick and the underbrush tangled like a net. No distractions, no people, just me and the wild. The first day was perfect. I hiked until my legs burned, set up camp near a small stream, and cooked my food over a crackling fire. The sun sank behind the trees, and the night took over, filling the world with the sound of insects and the distant hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet I had been craving for months. But then, sometime past midnight, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. My fire had burned down to embers, and my tent was completely zipped up. The night outside was black, the kind of darkness that made you feel like you were the only person left in the world. I listened, heart pounding, but heard nothing at first, just the normal sounds of the forest. Then I realized the insects had gone silent. That was the first sign. The absence of sound is its own kind of noise, and it pressed in on me like a weight. I lay still, barely breathing, listening for something, anything. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Not the heavy crunch of a bear or the skittering of small animals. These were slow, deliberate, spaced too evenly apart to be anything but human. They came from somewhere behind my tent, moving through the trees. I held my breath, my mind racing. Who the hell would be out here? I had hiked miles off trail, deep into the woods where no one else should be. I reached for my knife. My hands were slick with sweat. The footsteps stopped. I strained my ears, but there was nothing now. Just that awful, endless silence. My heart pounded so hard I thought whoever was out there would hear it. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I wasn't sure. Eventually, the insects started up again, hesitant at first, then returning to their full chorus. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping my knife, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. Morning came and everything looked normal. The The sunlight filtered through the trees, dappling the ground in gold. Birds chirped, the stream gurgled. It was like the night before had never happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, watching. I checked around my campsite. There were no footprints, no broken branches, nothing to prove what I'd heard. Maybe I had imagined it, I told myself. Maybe I had been half dreaming. But that didn't explain the silence. The way the night had held its breath. I thought about leaving, packing up and heading back to my car. But I had planned for 2 nights, and I wasn't ready to let fear drive me out of the woods. I convinced myself it was just paranoia. The mind plays tricks in the dark. The second night, I built my fire bigger. I ate my dinner with my knife in reach. The night sounds returned, and for a while, everything felt normal again. But when I finally crawled into my tent, exhaustion weighing me down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I woke up again sometime past midnight. This time, there was no slow realization, no moment of confusion. I woke up because I heard breathing, right outside my tent. Deep, steady, too close. I didn't move. My body locked up, every muscle frozen. The breathing continued, slow and controlled, just beyond the thin layer of nylon separating me from whatever was out there. My fingers inched toward my knife. My mind screamed at me to do something, to make a sound, to move, but I couldn't. The breathing stopped. Silence. Then, a slow, deliberate tug at the corner of my tent. I exploded out of my sleeping bag, my hand ripping my knife free. My other hand fumbled for my flashlight, but by the time I turned it on, there was nothing there. My tent flap was closed. My fire had burned low, casting weak, flickering light. The forest stood still, undisturbed. But I knew what I had heard. I knew what I had felt. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the fire, knife in hand, watching the trees. The feeling of being watched never left. When dawn broke, I packed my gear as fast as I could and started hiking. I didn't care about food, about rest. I just wanted to get out. I moved fast, faster than I ever had before, pushing through the underbrush, barely stopping for water. Hours passed. The forest seemed endless. I checked my GPS, but something felt off. I should have been closer to my car by now. Then, just as panic started to creep in, I saw it, a piece of cloth, hanging from a tree branch like someone had tied it there. It wasn't mine. I ran. Branches tore at my skin. My lungs burned. I didn't stop until I saw my car, sitting untouched at the edge of the dirt road. I threw my gear in, locked the doors, and peeled out of there so fast my tires kicked up gravel. I don't know what was out there. I don't want to know. I haven't been camping alone since, and I never will again. I was never one for camping. Sleeping on the ground, no showers, no real food. None of it ever seemed fun to me. But my friend Jake had been begging me for years to join him on one of his trips. And after enough pestering, I finally gave in. He had this spot deep in the woods, a place his dad had taken him when he was a kid. Supposedly, no one ever went there, just a clearing by a lake miles from civilization. No cell service, no roads, just the forest all around you. He said it was peaceful. I should have known better. The hike in was brutal. The trail was overgrown. Barely a path at all, just a faded line in the dirt from where Jake had last been there. Thick trees pressed in from all sides, their branches reaching out like claws. Felt like we were being swallowed by the woods. The only sounds were our breathing and the occasional rustling of animals in the underbrush. By the time we reached the clearing, my legs were aching, my shirt soaked with sweat. The lake was still, too still. No ripples, no movement, just a glassy surface reflecting the trees and sky. I remember thinking it looked almost fake, like a painting. Jake was excited, though. He dropped his pack and stretched, looking around like he was home. I set up my tent in silence, feeling uneasy but not wanting to say anything. It was just the wilderness, I told myself, just the quiet of nature. That first night, I barely slept. The forest was too loud. Crickets, owls, rustling in the bushes. Every little sound made my heart race. I kept imagining something creeping outside my tent, just beyond the thin layer of nylon. I knew it was stupid. It was probably just a raccoon or a deer, but my mind wouldn't stop spinning. At some point, exhaustion won, and I drifted off, but it wasn't restful. The next morning, Jake wanted to explore. We hiked around the lake, following game trails that wound through the trees. It was unsettling how quickly everything started to look the same. Every tree, every patch of ferns, every fallen log, it all blurred together. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone there, but there was nothing, just endless trees. Then we found the cabin. It was old, falling apart, half hidden by the forest. The wood was gray, eaten by time and weather. The door hung open, the hinges rusted. Jake grinned like a kid on Christmas and stepped inside without hesitation. I hesitated. Something about it felt wrong, like it shouldn't be there, like it was waiting, but I followed him in. The inside was worse. A small room, a broken table, a rotting chair, a fireplace filled with ash. But it was the smell that got me, like something damp and sour, something that had been left too long. And the bed. The mattress was still there, stained and sagging, like someone had been there not too long ago. But there was no sign of anyone, no footprints, no belongings, just that awful smell. Jake laughed it off. Just an old hunter's shack, he said. Probably abandoned decades ago. I didn't believe that. Someone had been there, and not long ago. That night, I couldn't sleep again. The wind picked up, rustling the trees, making them creak and groan. I thought I heard footsteps outside the tent, but every time I unzipped it and looked out, there was nothing. Just darkness and the trees swaying in the wind. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things. I wanted to believe that. The next morning, I found footprints by the tents. Not ours. Ours were deep, heavy, spaced apart. These were smaller, lighter, barefoot, leading from the woods to my tent and then back again. I didn't say anything to Jake. I just packed my stuff as fast as I could. He gave me a weird look but didn't argue when I said I wanted to leave. We started the hike back, but something felt off. The woods were different. The silence was heavier, like the trees were listening, watching. Halfway back, we realized we were lost. The trail was gone. No marker, no sign of where we had come from. Jake swore he knew the way, but after another hour of walking in circles, I knew he was just as lost as I was. We were trapped, swallowed by the forest. The sun was starting to dip, and panic set in. That's when we saw him, a man, standing between the trees, half hidden by the shadows. Just standing there, not moving, not speaking, watching. Jake called out, but the man didn't respond. He just stood there. Then, without a sound, he turned and walked into the woods. Jake wanted to follow. I refused. Something about the way the man moved, it wasn't right. Too smooth, too silent. He didn't make a single noise as he stepped through the underbrush. I told Jake we needed to go the other way, fast. He argued but eventually gave in. We walked as quickly as we could, not speaking, just moving. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the man again, but he was gone. We walked until the sun was gone, and the forest was pitch black. Then we saw the cabin again. We had been walking in circles. My stomach dropped. Jake swore, kicking the ground, his voice shaky. I looked around, shining my flashlight through the trees, expecting to see that man again. Nothing, just the cabin, standing there like it had been waiting for us. We had no choice but to stay the night. Inside, the smell was worse. I didn't sit, didn't rest. I just stood in the corner, my back against the wall, gripping my flashlight like a weapon. Jake eventually fell asleep on the floor, but I couldn't. Every sound made my skin crawl. Then, in the middle of the night, the door creaked. Not the wind, not an animal. The door, moving, opening. I held my breath, listened. Footsteps, soft and slow, moving toward me. I shined my light. Nothing, just the open door, the dark forest beyond. I grabbed Jake, shaking him awake. We need to go, now. He didn't argue. We ran. Didn't care about direction, didn't care about anything except getting away from that place. At some point, the trees thinned. The road appeared like a miracle, our car still sitting where we had left it. We didn't stop running until we were inside, doors locked, engine roaring to life. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if anyone was watching. We never spoke about it. I never went camping again. I had been planning this cabin trip for weeks. The idea was simple: get away from the noise of everyday life, clear my head, and spend a few nights alone in the wilderness. I picked a remote cabin deep in the woods, far from the usual tourist spots. I wanted complete isolation, just me and nature. I packed all the essentials: food, water, flashlight, knife, and a small axe. I even brought a notebook, thinking I might jot down some thoughts while sitting by the fireplace at night. The drive to the cabin was tougher than I expected. The narrow dirt road leading up to it was barely visible under fallen leaves and overgrown bushes. It had been years since anyone had stayed there, and it showed. The wooden structure looked aged but sturdy, with a slanted roof covered in moss. The windows were coated in a layer of dust, and the porch creaked under my weight as I stepped up to the front door. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was stale, carrying the scent of damp wood and old fabric. A single-room layout greeted me. A small kitchen area, a wooden table, a stone fireplace, and a bed pushed against the far wall. It was simple, exactly what I wanted. I opened a few windows to let in fresh air and started unpacking. The first night was uneventful. I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal, listening to the distant sounds of the forest. Occasionally, a gust of wind would rattle the branches outside, but it was peaceful. I went to bed early, letting the quiet surround me. The second day, I explored the area around the cabin. There was a small trail behind it, leading deeper into the woods. I followed it for a while, stepping carefully over fallen branches and damp earth. I found an old hunting blind, half collapsed and covered in vines. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. I felt a strange sense of unease, like I was being watched. The thought stuck with me as I turned back toward the cabin. That night, as I sat by the fire, I had the strange feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept looking toward the windows, expecting to see movement in the darkness beyond. The woods seemed different at night. Shadows stretched in unnatural ways. Tree branches swayed even when there was no wind. But I told myself it was just my imagination. Then, in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. At first, I didn't know what had disturbed me. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a faint red light across the cabin. I listened, straining to hear beyond the normal creaks of the wooden walls. Then I caught its soft, deliberate footsteps just outside the cabin. My heart pounded. I lay completely still, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped near the porch. It wasn't an animal. Animals move erratically, but this was different. This was controlled, purposeful. Someone was out there. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. The wooden floor was cold beneath my bare feet as I slowly stood up. The footsteps started again, moving along the side of the cabin. My breath was shallow, my body tense. I stepped toward the door, pressing my ear against it. The footsteps stopped again, right outside the entrance. I stared at the thin wooden barrier separating me from whoever or whatever was on the other side. I wanted to open it, to look, but my instincts screamed at me to stay still. Minutes passed. The silence was unbearable. Then, just as suddenly as they had come, the footsteps moved away, disappearing into the woods. I waited for what felt like an eternity before finally allowing myself to breathe again. The next morning, I searched the area around the cabin. There were no footprints, nothing to indicate that someone had been there. But I knew what I had heard. It hadn't been a dream. I debated packing up and leaving, but part of me didn't want to give in to fear. I told myself that if something had wanted to harm me, it would have done so last night. I convinced myself to stay one more night. That day, I stuck close to the cabin, keeping my knife within reach at all times. As the sun began to set, I built a larger fire than usual, hoping it would keep whatever was out there at bay. I sat with my back against the wall, my ears tuned to every sound. It happened again that night. The footsteps returned, circling the cabin just like before. But this time, they didn't stop at the entrance. They moved closer to the windows, then back toward the trees. I could hear slow, deliberate breathing, deep, steady inhales and exhales. I gripped my knife, my pulse hammering in my ears. I knew I couldn't stay another night. As soon as the first light of dawn touched the trees, I packed up as quickly as I could. I didn't even bother eating breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. The drive back felt longer than it had on the way in. Every sound made me jump. Every rustling branch sent a wave of fear through me. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But I never did. When I finally reached home, I locked the doors behind me and sat in silence. I never went back to that cabin. I never even told anyone the full story. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear those footsteps in my mind. Slow, deliberate, unmistakably human. And I know, without a doubt, that I was not alone in those woods. I had been planning this trip for months. A solo trip to a remote cabin deep in the woods, far from civilization, away from everything. I wanted complete solitude, just me, the trees, and the quiet. I had rented a small hunting cabin, miles away from any roads or towns. It was old but sturdy, with a wood-burning stove, a small bed, and a storage area for supplies. No electricity, no running water, just the basics. The drive to the closest parking area was long, miles of winding dirt roads. I parked in a clearing, locked up my truck, and checked my pack. I had all my gear, food, water, warm clothing, a rifle, and enough supplies for a week. The hike to the cabin was about 5 miles through dense forest, with no marked trails. I had a map and compass, but I had studied the area enough to navigate without much trouble. The first few miles were peaceful. The sun was shining, the air was crisp, and the forest smelled of damp earth and pine. The only sounds were my boots crunching on leaves and the distant calls of birds. No signs of people, no signs of anything unusual, just the way I wanted it. When I reached the cabin, it looked just as I expected, small, weathered, isolated. There was a stack of firewood against the side, likely left by the last person who stayed here. The door was locked, just as the owner had said it would be. I pulled out the key, unlocked it, and stepped inside. The air was stale, untouched for weeks, maybe months. Dust covered the wooden floor, and a few cobwebs clung to the corners of the ceiling. I set down my pack, stretched, and started setting up. I checked the small wood stove, making sure it was still in working order. The chimney was clear. I stacked some wood inside, ready for the night. The single window had a wooden shutter that could be latched from the inside. It wasn't much, but it would keep the wind out. By late afternoon, I had settled in. I chopped some more firewood, made a simple meal, and sat outside watching the trees. The silence was almost too much. No distant cars, no voices, just the wind through the branches. It was peaceful, but something about it made me uneasy. That night, I lit a fire, ate, and locked up. The inside of the cabin was warm, the flames casting flickering shadows on the walls. As I lay in bed, I listened to the woods. At first, just the usual sounds: wind, creaking trees, the occasional rustle in the bushes. But then something else. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, not an animal, too heavy. They stopped just outside the cabin. I held my breath, listening. No knocking, no attempt to open the door, just silence. Then, after what felt like forever, the footsteps moved away. I didn't sleep. To first light, I stepped outside. No signs of anything, no footprints, but I knew what I heard. Someone had been there. I spent the day checking the area. I walked a half-mile in each direction, looking for signs of a campsite or another cabin. Nothing, just endless trees. That evening, I locked up again, kept my rifle close, and waited. Around midnight, the footsteps came back. This time, they circled the cabin. Slow, steady. My heart pounded. I stayed completely still. Then, just as before, they faded into the distance. At sunrise, I packed up, I wasn't gonna wait around to see who it was or what they wanted. I left nothing behind, locked up the cabin, and started hiking back. Halfway to my truck, I saw something that stopped me cold. A boot print, fresh, leading away from the direction of the cabin. Someone had been following me. I didn't stop moving. When I reached my truck, I threw my gear inside, locked the doors, and drove until I was miles away. I never went back to that cabin. Maybe it was just a hunter. Maybe it wasn't. But I wasn't about to find out. Some places are better left alone. I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. A few days alone in a remote cabin, deep in the woods, away from everything. No phone service, no distractions, just quiet. That was the plan. I had rented the cabin from a small listing I found online. It was old, simple, and far from any major roads. It had been used mostly as a hunting cabin, according to the description. There was a single dirt path leading to it, barely wide enough for my truck. It was exactly what I wanted. The drive out took longer than expected. The last stretch was rough, the road uneven, potholes filled with water from recent rain. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was getting low, casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin itself looked like something from an old photograph. Weathered wood, a small porch, and a tin roof. It stood alone, surrounded by thick forest. The nearest neighbor was miles away. I parked and stepped out, stretching after the long drive. The air was fresh, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. There was no noise except for the occasional rustling of leaves. No cars, no people, just silence. I liked it. The inside of the cabin was simple. One main room with a small kitchen area, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a couch against the far wall. A door led to a tiny bedroom with a single bed, and there was a bathroom with an old shower that barely worked. It wasn't luxury, but it was what I needed. I unpacked my things, set up my sleeping bag on the bed, and started a fire in the old wood stove. The temperature had dropped fast, and the warmth was welcome. I made a quick meal, ate at the table, and then sat on the porch for a while, watching the woods darken. The trees were so thick that once the sun was gone, it felt like the world ended just beyond the cabin's small clearing. That night, I slept lightly. The bed was uncomfortable, and the wind outside made the trees creak. I woke up a few times, feeling like something had disturbed me, but there was nothing, just the silence pressing in. At some point, I fell into a deeper sleep. The next morning, I woke up early. The fire had died, and the air inside was cold. I got up, stretched, and went outside to gather some firewood. The cabin had a small shed a few yards away, stocked with dry logs. As I walked over, I noticed something that made me stop. There were footprints in the dirt. Not mine. They were fresh, leading from the woods to the porch, stopping right at the front door. Then they turned and went back into the trees. They were deep, meaning whoever left them was heavy, maybe wearing boots. My own tracks from the day before were still visible, but these were new. I stood there, staring at them. It didn't make sense. No one should have been out here. I had heard nothing during the night. The forest was dense, the undergrowth thick. It wasn't the kind of place you just wandered through by accident. I shook off the uneasy feeling, telling myself it was probably an old hunter passing through. Maybe they saw the cabin, got curious, and left. That made sense. Still, I felt unsettled. I brought the firewood inside, lit the stove again, and made some coffee. The warmth helped, but the thought of those footprints stuck with me. I spent most of the day hiking around the area, exploring a little. The woods were dense, but I found an old overgrown trail that seemed to lead somewhere deeper. I followed it for a while before turning back, not wanting to go too far from the cabin. By the time I got back, the sun was already starting to set. I cooked a quick meal, ate, and then sat by the fire, listening to the wood crackle. Outside, the woods had gone silent again. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence, it felt different, heavy, like something was out there, just beyond the tree line. That night, I woke up again, but this time I knew why. There was a sound outside. Slow, steady footsteps, moving around the cabin. I froze, my heart pounding. The footsteps weren't hurried, not like an animal moving through the underbrush. They were deliberate, careful. They stopped near the porch. Then silence. I reached for the flashlight next to my bed, gripping it tightly. I listened, waiting. Minutes passed. Nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the silence was messing with my mind. But I knew that wasn't true. Someone had been outside. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When it did, I went outside immediately, scanning the ground. The footprints were there again, fresh. They circled the cabin this time. Whoever it was had walked around it, stopping at the windows, the door, watching. I decided to leave. Whatever peaceful trip I had planned was over. I packed quickly, throwing everything into my bag. I didn't bother with breakfast. As I loaded my things into the truck, I glanced back at the woods. Nothing moved, but I felt something there, watching. The drive back was tense. Every time I glanced in the mirror, I expected to see someone step out of the trees. But there was nothing, just the empty road stretching ahead. When I finally reached town, I pulled into a gas station and sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel. The silence of that forest, those slow, deliberate footsteps in the night, I couldn't shake it. I never went back to that cabin. I never even tried to find out who had been there. Some things, I think, are better left unknown. I had always wanted to spend some time alone in a cabin, away from everything. Life had been stressful and I needed a break. A friend of mine had mentioned an old family-owned cabin deep in the woods that wasn't used anymore. He told me I could stay there for a few days if I wanted. It wasn't anything fancy, but it had electricity, running water, and enough supplies to last a while. It seemed perfect. The drive was long. The paved roads turned into dirt ones, and eventually, I had to park my car and hike the last stretch. The cabin was isolated, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence. It looked old but solid, with thick wooden walls and a simple porch out front. There were no neighbors, no signs of people for miles. Exactly what I wanted. The inside was basic but comfortable. A fireplace, a small kitchen, an old wooden table, and a single bedroom with a creaky bed. The windows were covered in dust. The air smelled like wood and age. There was a radio but no phone signal. I didn't mind. I had brought books, food, and enough to keep me busy. The first day was peaceful. I sat on the porch, listened to the wind in the trees, and felt my stress melt away. I cooked a simple meal, read for a while, and went to bed early. The quiet was soothing. The first night, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. Then I heard something outside. It wasn't loud, just a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. I stayed still, listening. Could have been an animal. A deer, maybe. I turned over, tried to ignore it, and eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, I found footprints near the porch. Not animal tracks. Human. They weren't mine. They circled the cabin, stopping just below the windows. My stomach tightened. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. The cabin was miles away from any main road, and I hadn't seen a single person on the way in. I told myself it was old. Maybe someone had been here before, maybe a hunter or hiker. The ground was dry, the prints could have been from days ago, but they looked fresh. I spent the day exploring the area, trying to shake the unease. The woods were dense, stretching endlessly in every direction. I found an old shed behind the cabin, mostly empty except for rusted tools and a pile of firewood. Nothing unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every now and then, I'd catch movement in the trees. Just shadows, I told myself. Just the wind. That night, I locked the doors and windows before going to bed. I kept the fire low, listened to the crackling, and tried to push my thoughts away. But I couldn't sleep. Hours passed, and I just lay there, staring at the ceiling. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving around the cabin. I held my breath, heart pounding. I wanted to believe it was an animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The steps were too steady, too human. They stopped right outside the window. I stayed completely still. The air felt heavy. Then I heard a soft sound. the doorknob turning. Not rattling, not forced, just a slow, quiet turn. Whoever it was, they were trying to be careful. The door was locked, but I knew that wouldn't matter if they really wanted to get in. My mind raced. I had a knife in the kitchen, a fire poker near the fireplace, but I didn't dare move. Minutes passed, stretched endlessly. Then the footsteps moved again, slowly, around the cabin, fading into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed awake, listening. When morning finally came, I stepped outside, half expecting to see nothing. But the footprints were there, fresh ones, leading from the woods, circling the cabin, stopping at the door. I packed my things, fast. I didn't care how peaceful the place was supposed to be. I wasn't staying another night. The hike back to my car felt longer than before. Every snap of a twig made my skin crawl. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, but there was nothing. Just trees, silence, and that unbearable feeling that I wasn't alone. When I finally reached my car, I locked the doors and drove until I was back on paved roads. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I never told my friend what happened. I just thanked him for letting me use the cabin and made up some excuse about cutting the trip short. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw, and I know someone was out there. I decided to rent a cabin deep in the woods for a weekend. I needed time away from everything. Work, people, the constant noise of the city. The thought of being completely alone in nature with no distractions sounded perfect. I found a place online, an old but well-maintained cabin that was far from any town, surrounded by nothing but forest. It had no Wi-Fi, no TV, and barely any cell service. That was exactly what I wanted. Just me, the woods, and some peace and quiet. The drive out was long. The roads got narrower the further I went, turning from paved to gravel, then finally to dirt. The last stretch had no signs, just a winding path through thick trees. I followed the directions carefully and eventually spotted the cabin, sitting alone at the end of the trail. It was small, with a slanted roof and a wraparound porch. The wood was dark and weathered, but everything looked sturdy. I parked my car next to the cabin and grabbed my bags. The air smelled fresh, the way only deep woods can. Everything was still and quiet. Too quiet. No birds, no wind through the trees, just an eerie silence. I brushed it off and unlocked the door, stepping inside. The place was simple, one main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a bedroom in the back. There was an old wooden table with 2 chairs, a dusty bookshelf, and a single couch facing the fireplace. The windows were small, and the only light came from the dim bulbs powered by a generator. It wasn't fancy, but it was exactly what I had wanted. I set my bags down and walked around, getting a feel for the place. The wooden floors creaked under my feet. The walls had old hunting photos and a few shelves with random books. The bed was small but looked comfortable enough. I checked my phone, no service. I expected that. The rental listing had warned about it. I took a deep breath and sat down on the couch, letting the silence settle in. It felt strange at first, but I told myself I would get used to it. As night fell, the cabin grew colder. I started a fire in the fireplace, using the stack of wood left by the owner. The flames flickered, casting shadows across the walls. I made a simple meal, ate by the fire, then stretched out on the couch with a book. The stillness of the place was almost soothing now. No emails, no traffic noise, just the crackling fire and the occasional creak of the old wood. Then I heard something outside, a faint rustling, like footsteps in the leaves. I sat up, listening. The fire popped, but beyond that, everything was still. I shook my head and went back to my book, convincing myself it was an animal, probably a deer or a raccoon. But the uneasy feeling stayed with me. When I went to bed, I made sure the door was locked, though I doubted anyone was out there. Who would be this deep in the woods? I woke up in the middle of the night. Something had pulled me from sleep, but I didn't know what. The fire had burned low, and the room was dim. I listened, holding my breath. Then I heard it, a soft scraping sound against the cabin wall. It was slow, deliberate. My skin prickled. I reached for my flashlight and pointed it at the window, but the glass reflected nothing but the faint glow of the embers. I waited, listening. The sound stopped. I stayed awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted back to sleep. Morning came, and I felt silly for being so on edge. I stepped outside with my coffee, taking in the fresh air. The ground was damp from the night's dew. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints, fresh ones, leading from the trees to the side of the cabin. They weren't mine. I looked around, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. The footprints didn't go all the way around the cabin. They stopped near the bedroom window. My chest tightened. Someone had been outside while I was sleeping, close enough to touch the walls. I looked back at the footprints, trying to judge their size. They were normal, too normal. Not boots, not hiking shoes. Just regular footprints, like someone had been walking barefoot. I went back inside and locked the door. My thoughts raced. Who would be out here? There were no other cabins nearby, no roads leading anywhere past mine. I checked my phone again. Still no service. I thought about leaving, but I had paid for the full weekend, and it seemed ridiculous to run just because of some footprints. Maybe some local had wandered by. Maybe it was a prank. I forced myself to push the fear away. The rest of the day was quiet. I stayed near the cabin, not wanting to go too deep into the woods. As the sun started to set, I double-checked all the locks and made sure the fire was big enough to last a while. I sat on the couch, listening. Nothing. The forest was silent again. Then, just as I was about to relax, I heard it. Tap. Light, almost hesitant, against the window. My stomach twisted. I turned my head slowly. My breath caught in my throat. The window was small, the glass slightly fogged from the cold air inside. I couldn't see anything out there. Another tap. My hands gripped the armrest of the couch. I didn't move. The tapping stopped. I stayed awake all night. I didn't sleep, didn't even close my eyes for more than a few minutes at a time. Every creak of the wood, every shift of the fire made me jump. When the first light of morning came, I had already made up my mind. I packed my things in record time, barely even stopping to eat. I didn't care if I had paid for another night. I was leaving. As I loaded my bag into the car, I looked at the cabin one last time. That's when I saw it. Something that made my breath catch. The footprints from the night before, they were gone. But there were new ones, fresh ones, leading from the cabin back into the woods. Someone had been watching me. I didn't stay to find out who. I got in my car and drove, not looking back. The road seemed longer this time, the trees pressing in on either side. I didn't stop until I was miles away. Even then, my hands were shaking on the wheel. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I do know one thing: I won't ever go back to that cabin again. I had been planning this solo camping trip for a while. Work had been stressful, and I needed some time alone in the woods to clear my head. I chose a remote location deep in the forest, far from any marked trails. I didn't want to deal with other campers. I wanted silence, just me and nature. The drive was long, taking me through winding mountain roads before I reached the rough dirt path leading to the forest. I parked my truck at the end of the trail, grabbed my gear, and started hiking in. The plan was simple. Hike about 10 miles in, set up camp by a small river I had seen on the map, and spend a few nights unwinding. I had packed enough supplies: food, water, a sturdy tent, and my hunting knife, just in case. The hike in was peaceful at first. The air smelled like pine, and the only sounds were birds and the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush. I felt good, away from the noise of the city. But about 5 miles in, I started feeling uneasy. There was no obvious reason for it. No strange noises, no signs of anything off, but something about the silence felt wrong. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my own breathing and boots crunching against the dirt. I shook it off and kept walking, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But that feeling of being watched never left. I reached the river just before sunset and quickly set up my tent. The river was exactly as I had imagined, calm, clear, and surrounded by thick trees. I filtered some water, cooked a simple meal, and sat by the fire, trying to enjoy the moment. As darkness settled in, I felt that uneasiness return. It was too quiet. Normally, you'd hear owls or crickets by now, but there was nothing. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself I was being paranoid. I crawled into my tent and forced myself to sleep. A sound woke me up in the middle of the night. It was faint, like something moving through the trees. I lay still, listening. It wasn't the wind. There was a deliberate pattern to it, like footsteps. Slow, careful steps. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, waiting, but nothing happened. After what felt like an eternity, I convinced myself it was just an animal and tried to go back to sleep. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach turn. About 30 feet from my campsite, there were footprints. Human footprints, barefoot. They circled my tent. Someone had been here watching me while I slept. I packed up immediately. My plan was to leave right away, but as I looked at the trail I had come from, something felt wrong. The footprints weren't just near my tent. They led back into the forest. And worse, they weren't alone. There were more prints now, like multiple people had been walking around. The realization sent a chill through me. I wasn't alone out here. I kept my knife in my hand as I started walking back. I moved quickly, but carefully, keeping my eyes on the trees around me. Every now and then, I heard something, branches snapping, faint rustling in the distance. It wasn't my imagination. Someone was following me. I forced myself to stay calm. Running would be a mistake. I could twist my ankle, get lost, or make too much noise. But I picked up my pace, my heart pounding. The sounds behind me grew louder, more frequent. Whoever they were, they weren't trying to be quiet anymore. Then I saw it, something that made my blood run cold. Hanging from a tree ahead of me was a bundle of sticks tied together with what looked like old, rotting fabric. It wasn't random. It was placed there, meant to be seen. I didn't stop to examine it. I kept moving, my breathing sharp and fast. The sounds behind me turned into full-on footsteps. They were running now. I could hear multiple sets of feet crunching leaves and snapping twigs. I was being hunted. I broke into a sprint. My lungs burned. My legs screamed at me, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just ran. The sounds behind me were getting closer. I knew I had only one chance: get to my truck. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the break in the trees. My truck was still there. I fumbled for my keys, hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. As I yanked it open and jumped inside, I caught a glimpse of something moving at the edge of the trees. I didn't see a face, just a shape, a dark figure stepping back into the shadows. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and peeled out of there so fast I nearly skidded off the dirt road. My hands were trembling. My heart felt like it was about to explode. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back on the main road. I never went back to that forest. I don't know who or what was out there, and I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. Someone had been waiting in those woods, watching, following, and if I had stayed another night, I don't think I would have made it out. I decided to go camping alone in a remote forest. I had always loved the quiet, the feeling of being completely disconnected from everything. The forest I chose was about 3 hours from the nearest town, deep in the mountains, and I had done enough research to know that hardly anyone went there. It was perfect, or at least that's what I thought. I packed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, some food, a flashlight, a knife, and other essentials. I had been camping alone before, so I wasn't too worried about it. The plan was simple. Hike to a good spot by a small lake I had found on a map, set up camp, spend the night, and hike back in the morning. The trail was rough and overgrown, but I liked that. It meant fewer people had been through here. The hike was longer than I expected. The path was uneven, and I had to stop several times to catch my breath. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees when I finally reached the lake. It was beautiful, untouched. The water was still, reflecting the deep greens of the forest around it. There was no wind, no sound except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. It was peaceful in a way that made you feel small. I set up my tent a few feet from the water, gathered some wood, and got a small fire going. The night air was crisp, and I sat by the fire, eating a sandwich and watching the flames flicker. It was quiet, too quiet. That was the first thing that unsettled me. Usually, you could hear insects, small animals moving through the underbrush, maybe even a distant howl from a coyote. But there was nothing, just silence. I shook it off, convincing myself that it was just because I was in such a remote place. After finishing my meal, I put out the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped myself into my sleeping bag. The ground was hard, but I was tired from the hike, and sleep came quickly. I woke up in the middle of the night. It wasn't a slow wake-up. I was instantly alert, my heart pounding. Something was outside. I could hear movement, slow, deliberate steps crunching the leaves just beyond my tent. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped. I strained to hear more, but there was only silence. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer, but something about the way it moved didn't feel right. It wasn't the quick, skittish movements of a wild animal. It was slow, purposeful. I stayed still, waiting. A long time passed, and I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been nothing and forced myself back to sleep. Morning came, and everything seemed normal again. I unzipped my tent, stepping out into the cool morning air. The forest was still quiet, but the feeling from the night before was gone. I packed up my things, making sure I left no trace behind. Before leaving, I walked down to the lake to splash some water on my face. That's when I saw it. Across the lake, on the opposite shore, there were footprints. Human footprints. They led from the treeline to the water and then stopped. There was no sign of anyone camping over there. No indication that someone had walked away. Just the prints leading to the edge of the water. And then nothing. I felt a chill run down my spine. Someone had been there, watching me, maybe while I slept. I stood there for a long time, staring at those prints, trying to make sense of them. Then, without thinking, I grabbed my bag and started hiking out. I didn't run, but I moved fast. Every so often, I stopped and listened. The silence was heavier now, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The hike back felt longer than the hike in. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like something, or someone, was behind me. I didn't see anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling. It stayed with me the whole way until I reached my car. I threw my gear into the back seat, got in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I didn't feel safe until I was miles away, back on the main road, civilization in sight. I never went back to that forest. I still think about those footprints sometimes, about the silence, about the slow, deliberate steps outside my tent. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe it was nothing. But deep down, I know that someone was out there, and they were watching me. I was looking for a break from my routine, something different from my usual weekends spent indoors. So I decided to go on a solo camping trip. I had been camping before, mostly with friends, but this time I wanted the quiet, the isolation. I wanted to be away from the noise of the city, away from people. I planned everything carefully, packing my gear, making sure I had enough food, and choosing a remote spot deep in the forest. The place I picked was about 3 hours from where I lived. It was a lesser-known camping area, which meant fewer people, maybe none at all. That's what I wanted. I drove most of the way and then hiked the last few miles with my backpack. The path was narrow, surrounded by tall trees that blocked most of the sunlight. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No sounds of cars, no distant voices, just the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirping of birds. After a couple of hours of hiking, I reached a small clearing near a lake. It was perfect. The water was still, reflecting the trees around it. I set up my tent near the edge, just close enough to hear the water but far enough to be safe. The air smelled fresh, the kind of clean scent you only find deep in the woods. As the sun started to set, I built a fire and cooked a simple meal. The warmth of the flames felt comforting against the cool evening air. I sat by the fire, enjoying the solitude, watching the sky darken. The stars came out one by one, filling the sky. It was peaceful. I didn't feel scared or uneasy, just relaxed. At some point, I heard rustling in the bushes behind me. I assumed it was an animal. I had read about deer and small critters in the area. I ignored it, but the sound didn't stop. It wasn't the kind of rustling made by the wind or a small animal moving through leaves. It was slower, deliberate. I turned my flashlight toward the trees, scanning the area. Nothing, just darkness and the shapes of trees. I told myself it was nothing and went back to my fire. The noise stopped. It was probably my imagination. The woods can play tricks on you when you're alone. I stayed up for a while longer before deciding to sleep. I put out the fire and got into my tent. The forest was silent now, except for the occasional sound of insects. I closed my eyes, listening to the stillness. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. It was pitch black, my tent completely zipped up, but something felt wrong. I lay still, trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, careful, close. I held my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was walking around my tent. I stayed completely still, listening. The footsteps circled my tent, stopping for long moments before continuing. They weren't heavy, but they weren't light either. Definitely human. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. My mind raced. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere? I hadn't seen a single person since I arrived. My car was parked miles away, and this spot wasn't easy to find. The footsteps stopped directly in front of my tent. Just standing there, I could feel my breath shaking. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Then the sound of fabric, someone pressing against my tent. I stayed frozen, gripping my knife so tight my hand ached. Then, after what felt like forever, the pressure disappeared. The footsteps started again, moving away this time. I waited, listening as they faded into the distance. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed alert, listening to every sound. When the sun finally rose, I unzipped my tent slowly and looked around. Nothing seemed disturbed. No footprints, no signs of anyone. But I knew what I heard. I packed up my things as fast as I could. My hands were shaking as I took down my tent. I didn't bother eating. I just wanted to leave. The hike back felt longer than before. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow looked like someone watching me. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief. I threw my gear inside and got in, locking the doors immediately. As I started the engine, I took one last look at the trail. That's when I saw it. A figure standing just at the tree line, watching me. Too far to see clearly, but close enough that I knew it was a person. They didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there. I didn't wait. I drove away as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the main road. I never went back to that place. I don't know who or what was out there with me that night, and I don't want to find out.